Chapter 1 of Cross Currents. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Cross Currents by Eleanor Porter. Chapter 1. The long train from the north rolled into the Grand Central Station and came to a jerky stop, while out the doors and down the steps surged a hurrying throng of men and women who seemed intent on reaching a given point in the shortest possible time. Back in the luxuriously appointed drawing-room car there was not so much haste, though even there silk-lined skirts rustled softly, and carefully creased trousers submitted themselves more or less graciously to the porter's whisk-broom. At the far end of the car, a tall, fair-haired woman in dark blue and a little girl 5 years old sat by themselves.
"Are we there? Is it New York?"
asked the girl eagerly.
"Yes, dear." "And now what do we do?"
"We take a carriage across the city, sweetheart."
"To go home?"
"No, dear. We don't go home until next month. If we were going there now, we should wait right here for another train. As it is, we have to cross the city. Come, Margaret. See, we are the last to leave," she added, as she gave a final pat to the black silk coat. "Now run along ahead, dear." Even the conductor had fallen captive to the big blue eyes and yellow curls under little Miss Margaret's drooping hat-brim, and he gave a nod and a pleasant smile as he lifted the child from the car steps to the platform. The porter, too, showed all his teeth in a broad grin. Once on the platform, Margaret hesitated, looking from one man to the other. It seemed to her that something was due these two kind friends who had been so good to her all day.
"Thank you,"
she said at last, in her sweet, high-pitched treble.
"I've had a very enjoyable time in your car. Good-bye."
Mrs. Kendall smiled and reached for her daughter's hand. The porter grinned even more broadly than before, but the conductor bowed very low with his hand on his heart. "It has been a pleasure to me, I assure you," he said gravely, and Margaret turned away well content. Mrs. Kendall still smiled all the long way down the narrow lane between the cars. It was so like Margaret, she thought, to do that, and so kind of the conductor to respond in that ready fashion to her quaint courtesy. Some would have laughed, and Margaret was always grieved when they laughed. She was a dear little girl anyway. Still, it was no wonder people called her quaint and old. And Mrs. Kendall's lips twitched as she thought of some of the large words that were her young daughter's special delight. In the big waiting room, Mrs. Kendall paused thoughtfully. A tiny frown was gathering between her brows when her glance fell upon a slim young woman sitting alone not 5 feet away. At that instant the young woman raised her eyes.
"Mrs. Kendall!"
she cried delightedly, springing to her feet.
"It is Mrs. Kendall, and little Margaret, too."
"Yes. And you are Miss Darrell?" smiled Mrs. Kendall. "I thought I knew your face. And how is your mother?" For some minutes the two ladies chatted pleasantly of things and people far removed from the hurrying throng about them, and Mrs. Kendall said in a low voice, "As you say you are to be here for some little time, Miss Darrell, would you mind keeping an eye on Margaret for a few minutes? I have an errand across the street, and I would rather not take her. She will give you no trouble, I am sure, for she quite prides herself on her ability to take care of herself."
"I should love to do it,"
declared Miss Darrell, and with a smile Mrs. Kendall turned to her daughter. "Margaret," she began gently, "Mother has an errand to do, something she wants to get at a store. It isn't far, just down a little way across the street. But she doesn't want to take you. Do you suppose you can stay here on one of these seats until she comes back? Miss Darrell will be here too, so you will not be alone. Will you stay, dear?" Margaret frowned and looked away. "Margaret would prefer to go too," she said emphatically. "Yes, I know, dear. But we can't do what we prefer to do all the time, sweetheart. The street is full of teams and people, and I don't want you with me when I cross it. So I'm very sure you are going to be my brave, patient little daughter and wait right here until I come back. Isn't that so, dear?" There was plainly a struggle, but in the end Margaret smiled, even though she sighed. "Yes, Mother, I suppose so," she admitted. "But please hurry," she added, as her mother helped her up onto one of the long seats. "Of course I'll hurry, precious," promised Mrs. Kendall with a kiss. "Now don't stir from the seat, dear, else Mother won't know where to find you. I'm sure she can trust you. Good-bye." And with a smile and a nod to Miss Darrell, she was gone. In appealing to her daughter's courage, Mrs. Kendall had done a wise thing, as she well knew. Such an appeal was seldom made in vain. Margaret's father, who had died when Margaret was a year old, had been a soldier, and whether it were a hurt finger or a rainy day that threatened to bring tears to Margaret's eyes, the warning, "Soldiers' daughters don't cry," never failed to bring a smile so brave that the tears could not fall. "Of course I'll hurry," Mrs. Kendall was murmuring as she sped through the station doorway. "Dear child, but I'll be back before she scarcely knows I am gone." The clerks, however, were busy when Mrs. Kendall reached the store, and there was considerable delay before she could leave with her purchase. Perhaps it was this that quickened her steps almost to a run, or perhaps it was the memory of a wistful yet bravely smiling face under a wide hat brim. Whatever it was, Mrs. Kendall was certainly keeping her promise to hurry as she stepped from the curbstone and started to cross the street. Was it a careless chauffeur or a wet cobblestone? No one seemed to know afterwards. But there came a scream, hoarse cries, and then the rush of many feet. Later, a limp, unconscious form in a bedraggled dress of blue was lifted by tender hands into the ambulance which had been hastily summoned, and which at once drove away with its burden. Back in the street, 3 policemen tried to bring order out of the chaos of shouting, gesticulating men and boys, and in the confusion no one noticed the little urchin that dived under a wagon and captured a lady's handbag, small, expensively made, and bearing the monogram AWK. "Whew! Wasn't she a swell one?" cried the boy a minute later, as he was examining his treasure in the seclusion of an alleyway nearby. "Whew!" He whistled again, as he stuffed silver and bills into his pockets. "I reckon the gang gets a spree tonight, all right." He paused and gazed with frowning eyes at what was left in his lap. 2 keys, 2 trunk checks, a card or two, and a letter addressed to Mrs. Frank Kendall. I reckon this is best for them," he muttered, as he tore letter and cards into fragments. "And I reckon it's just as well if I ain't found with this stuff," he added, as he dropped bag, keys, and trunk checks into a convenient ash barrel. The next instant he gave a wild shout and raced off in search of de gang and de spree. End of Chapter 1. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 2 of Cross Currents. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. For the first 10 minutes after Mrs. Kendall had disappeared through the big doors of the waiting room, Miss Darrell devoted herself unreservedly to her small charge, finding great delight in Margaret's quaint words and ways. Then a breathless young girl with flying hair and a disarranged neck bow hurried towards them and claimed Miss Darrell's instant attention.
"Come," she panted. "Cousin Frank told me there was an earlier train, and I've nearly killed myself trying to get here in time. The ticket man says we've got 4 minutes now. Quick, we can just make it." "But—" Miss Darrell hesitated, her eyes on Margaret. For reasons best known to herself, this earlier train was especially desirable. It would be a pity to lose it, particularly when Mrs. Kendall was probably even now almost within call. "Do you mind waiting just a minute alone, dear?" she asked Margaret hurriedly, catching up her bag and the magazine she had been reading. "Mother'll be right back away, you know. Do you mind?" "Certainly not," assured Margaret with grave politeness. "I prefer to have you go." "You little dear. Good-bye," laughed Miss Darrell over her shoulder as she hurried away. "Mother's coming, you know." Left to herself in the huge waiting room, Margaret looked about her with lively interest. There was a lady with a pet dog near by, and there was a young girl with a cat in a basket across the way. The dog strained at his leash, and the cat pushed its head through the round hole at the top of the basket and made frantic efforts to shake itself free. But the basket and the leash were both strong, and all that the cat and the dog could do was to spit and to bark. By and by the woman with the dog got up and went away, and Margaret had only the cat to watch. "You may come over here, little girl, if you like," said the owner of the cat pleasantly, as she noticed Margaret's interested gaze. "I think Tiddlekins would love to meet you." Margaret had almost slipped from her seat to the floor when she suddenly bethought herself of her mother's admonitions. "No, thank you," she said with much dignity, settling back in her seat. "I promised not to move. I'm waiting for Mother." "Then Tiddlekins and I will come to you," replied the young girl graciously, as she crossed to Margaret's side. "There now, this is all right, isn't it, Tiddlekins?" she finished, patting the cat's head. For 10 minutes Margaret forgot everything but the cat with the yellow eyes, the enchanting purr, and the 7-toed feet, which last the girl cautiously pulled out of the basket for inspection. Then the cat and the girl hurried away to take a train, and Margaret suddenly realized that she was alone, and that her mother had been gone a long, long time. Quick tears came to the little girl's eyes, but she forced them back. "Cry? Of course I'm not going to cry," she stormed hotly to herself. "Soldiers' daughters don't cry." So she lifted her chin and tossed back her curls and swung her feet very hard. She even began to hum a little song, a wavering, quavering little song full of pitiful jerks and breaks. Richly grown young women glanced at her and passed by. Motherly old women looked at her closely and went by with more hesitating steps. One turned back and spoke. "Are you alone, little girl?" she asked gently. Margaret shook her head. "I'm waiting for my mother," she faltered. "Oh, that's all right," said the woman, with a relieved sigh as she went on. But at the door she paused and looked back, and her face was troubled. An hour passed, and still Margaret sat on the seat alone. The quavering little song had long ago stopped, and in spite of the soldier father, hot tears had from time to time rolled down the flushed cheeks and splashed on the black silk coat with its broad lace collar. More people came and went, and more women asked questions. Once a blue-coated man eyed her sharply, and then spoke to her.
but to all she gave the same reply.
I'm waiting for my mother. I must stay right here. She said so.
To poor little Margaret it seemed hours since she began to watch the great door through which she had seen her mother disappear. So many, many people had passed through it since, and so many, many blue dresses had come into sight to bring a throb of joy to her heart. But every time the blue dress had turned aside, and every time its wearer had shown an unfamiliar face to the anxious little maid watching so intently, after a time it seemed to Margaret that if only she could reach the door, it would be better there. She could see her mother more quickly when she came in. To be sure, there was the wide empty space between herself and the door, and she did not like to cross it alone. Then, too, her mother had told her to stay where she was. Still, if she went to meet her, surely mother could not mind that. Just as all this was reasoned out to Margaret's satisfaction, a man, a woman, and 3 children passed quite close to her seat, and with a glad little cry Margaret slipped to the floor, and in their company passed safely across the wide empty space between her seat and the door. On the outer steps she paused. Even here mother was nowhere to be seen, though Margaret looked with anxious eyes up, down, and across the street. Still it was far better than inside. There was so much to take up one's attention, and surely here mother must soon come into sight, Margaret told herself. Little by little the hurrying throngs crowded Margaret quite off the steps and on to the sidewalk. As in the waiting room, people stared, and women and a blue-coated man asked questions. And as in the waiting room, she answered bravely, "I'm waiting for mother." 5, 8, 10 minutes passed, and no mother came. Margaret was thoroughly frightened now, and scarcely realizing what she did, she ran swiftly down the street to the corner. Surely there, where the 2 ways crossed, she might catch the first glimpse of the beloved blue dress. It was then that the city in all its wonder and terror burst upon the little girl's frightened eyes. Everywhere were cabs, cars, carriages, people, and automobiles. Everywhere were noise and confusion. A fire engine dashed across the avenue a block away, and in the hurrying rush of many feet toward it, Margaret was swept along with the crowd. Not until she was completely out of breath did she find herself flung to one side against the big brass railing of a store window. Then, with a frightened cry, she turned and tried to go back the way she had come.
The seat! The seat! I must get back to the seat in the big tall room, or mother'll never find me, she moaned as she stumbled along. But the seat and the big tall room were not so easily found. The very first turn Margaret made was a wrong one, and every step after that carried her farther and farther away from the station. On and on hurried the little girl, stumbling, falling, and picking herself up again. The black silk coat grew soiled and rumpled, and the wide-brimmed hat drooped forlornly over one ear. The streets grew narrower and dirtier, and the people on them more noisy and rough. It was almost dark, too, and Margaret was beginning to be hungry. At last, exhausted and thoroughly frightened, she dropped down on a doorstep and began to cry.
I don't care, she sobbed. If father was a little girl all alone, he'd cry, even if he was a soldier.
Hello, kid. What's up?
Asked a voice. Margaret raised her head in astonishment. Before her stood a boy with very large freckles and a very small nose.
I say, what's up, kid?
He asked again.
My name is Margaret,
returned that young person with some dignity, trying very hard to force back the tears. To cry was one thing, but to cry before strange little boys was quite another.
Well,
Margaret, then?" jeered the boy, good-naturedly.
What's up? What are you crying for?" "I'm not crying,"
choked Margaret.
"My father was a soldier."
The boy took a step forward. His face showed a lively interest.
"Whereabouts? Did he get killed?"
Margaret stared without speaking.
"I say, did he get killed?" repeated the boy. "Is that what makes you cry? 'Cause he was a soldier?"
It was the boy's turn now to be amazed, for the little girl on the steps sprang suddenly upright and stamped her foot.
"I tell you it's 'cause he was a soldier that I don't cry. Soldiers' daughters never cry," she stormed wrathfully. "I should think you'd be ashamed to say they do. But I guess if you couldn't find the big tall room, nor the seat, nor mother, nor anything, and if you hadn't had anything to eat for ever and ever so long, you'd cry, even if your father was a soldier."
And down fell the soldier's daughter in a forlorn little sobbing heap on the bottom step. For a moment the boy stared in blank surprise. Then he gave a low whistle.
"Golly!" he exclaimed. "You're a spunky little thing, anyhow, and I like ye. Come, tell us about it."
And he dropped himself down at the little girl's side.
"Jiminy!"
he cried frowningly after he had heard Margaret's story.
"I bet ye 'twas the Grand Central whar she left ye. I bet you 2 cents 'twas."
"Oh, do you know the place? Can you find it? Will you take me?" panted Margaret.
"Come, let's hurry."
Slow up, cautioned the boy with a grin.
"'Tain't no picnic getting thar. It's a mighty long ways. You know how fur 'twas coming here?" I know,"
acknowledged Margaret, fairly dancing up and down in her eagerness to be off.
"But you see, there's mother at the end of it this time. Come."
And at the word the boy, too, sprang to his feet and turned his face toward 42nd Street. End of Chapter 2, read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 3 of Cross Currents. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. It was dark when a barefooted boy led into the Grand Central Station a little girl in a rumpled black silk coat. The walk had been a long one for weary little feet unaccustomed to such journeyings, but it was taken by a soldier's daughter, and with a loved mother for a goal, hence its final accomplishment. For a minute after entering the waiting room, the lights were blinding. Then Margaret led the way straight to her old seat. She had no trouble in finding it, for she had sat there so long she knew its exact location. The seat was empty.
"Why, she hasn't come yet,"
faltered Margaret. The boy noted the quivering chin and tightened his grip on the small hand.
"Ho, she's just a-sittin' somewhere else, that's all," he comforted cheerily. "We'll take a look and see where she is. Now, some girls 'd cry, and I ain't got no use for them kind of girls. But you being a soldier's daughter I ain't got to worry about that, have I?" he finished.
"Certainly not,"
assured Margaret, gulping back the sobs that would rise in her throat.
"Come, we'll go find her. She probably preferred to sit somewhere else."
In and out the rows of seats trudged the 2 children, scrutinizing every woman's face, being themselves, meanwhile, utterly unconscious of the many curious glances cast in their own direction by those who wondered at the ill-assorted pair.
"She had on a beautiful blue dress, and she said she was certain
She wouldn't be gone but a minute," murmured Margaret, plaintively, after a time. "She said 'twas just down a little way across the street." The boy stopped abruptly and pulled his companion to one side. "Did ye say blue?" he asked in a curiously strained voice. "Did ye say a blue dress, and did she go across the street?" "Yes, yes," nodded Margaret. The boy dropped the little girl's arm and fell back a step. He turned his gaze away from the wide-open blue eyes so earnestly questioning him. It seemed to him that they must see in his own eyes the reflection of the dreadful thought that had come to him. That limp form lifted into the ambulance a few hours before in front of this very station, was that the solution of the mystery? He had seen the whole thing, and the woman was dressed in blue. "Look-a-here, we better be going," he stammered feverishly, again catching hold of Margaret's arm. I don't reckon she's coming no more tonight anyhow. Come home with me." To do this, however, Margaret stoutly refused, and not until the boy hit upon the plan of leaving a note in the seat for the mother did the child consent to stir from the place. Then, hungry, frightened, and so tired she could scarcely walk, she suffered herself to be led out into the warm June night. "Ye see, it's the only way," soothed the boy, as they trudged along. "Your ma ain't thar, and she ain't a-comin' ternight, I'm just sure. We can give ye something ter eat, that is if Dad ain't around, and I reckon he won't be. He ain't due sober for 2 days yet. Besides, there's the letter, you know." The boy was proud of that letter. At the same time, he was a bit ashamed. It seemed a shabby thing, this taking advantage of such innocence. On the other hand, if he had not taken advantage of it, the poor little thing at his side would even now be back there in the station waiting for the mother who would never come. The boy was very sure the mother was dead. The note had been written on a torn scrap of brown paper with an old lead pencil stub, which the boy had abstracted from the strings, marbles, nails, and cigar stumps in his pocket. It had been written at Margaret's dictation, with an occasional remonstrative, "I say, ain't thar anything smaller?" from the boy, when a big word threatened ignominious defeat to the speller. As the note, half-printed, half-written, finally stood, it read, "My darling mother, I have gone with the boy to get something to eat. I preferred to remain here, but my stomach refused to stay. I cannot go to you, but you can come to me, so come please. Your affectionate," blurred with much erasing, "daughter, Margaret." It was after what seemed to Margaret a very long time that the boy turned into a dirty hall and began to climb the stairs. "Thar, here we be," he called back cheerily. "Come right on up." "Yes, I'm coming," sighed Margaret, dragging one foot after the other up the stairs, and hoping that her voice did not show how very unpleasant she thought this little boy's home was, with its hallways so dark and ill-smelling. "My stars," she panted at the bottom of the 4th flight. "What a remarkable place for a parlor, way up in the attic so." The boy did not hear. He had clattered up the last flight and burst open the door. "Mumsy, look at what I bringed home this time." "Dear me, Bobby, your sick dogs and mangy cats'll be the death of me yet," returned a tired-sounding voice. "I told ye last week I shouldn't let another one, Bobby McGinnis."
broke off the voice sharply, as Margaret came into the shaft of light from the kerosene lamp. "Where did you get that child?" "She's lost, Mumsy, and she's awful hungry. I bringed her home to get some grub. Her ma left her in Grand Central, and she got—" Bobby crossed to his mother's side and finished his sentence under his breath so that the little girl by the door should not hear. "Oh, Bobby," cried Mrs. McGinnis in a horrified voice, as she darted over to the child and drew her gently into the room. "But, Bobby, there's your father." "Pooh! Don't ye fret none 'bout him. I see him Saturday down to Lil Mike's, and he was with that long-haired anarchist fella. And ye know he always gets the biggest kind of a jag on when he's with him. He won't come botherin' round here yet a while. Like enough he's jugged anyhow by this time," finished Bobby hopefully. The woman shivered a little, then turned to the child at her side. "What's your name, dearie?" "Margaret." "Margaret what?" "Margaret Kendall." "Where do you live?" The little girl hesitated and looked distressed. "I mean, where is your home, dearie? Where do you live?" "In a trunk, please." "In a what?" Margaret looked still more distressed. "A trunk. I don't exactly understand it myself, you see, but that's what Mother said last night. She said, 'Sweetheart, it's been travel for a whole year, but next month we're going home. We've just been living in a trunk all the time.'" "Say, Mumsy, ain't she great?" cut in Bobby admiringly. "She's been carrying on like that all the time. She's more fun than a circus." "Hush, Bobby, hush," remonstrated Mrs. McGinnis. Then she turned again to the little girl. "But where's the home that you're going to? You know that, don't you, dear?" Margaret shook her head. "What's the name of the town? Don't you remember anything about it? Not anything?" Margaret frowned and tried very hard to remember. She had her opinion of people who insisted upon asking all sorts of unnecessary questions when one was so tired and so hungry, but still she must not forget to be very polite. "No, thank you. Oh, yes, I do," she broke off triumphantly. "There's a big stone lion on each side of the steps where I live. That's the house." Bobby gave a wild whoop, but his mother gave a sigh of despair. Margaret herself broke the pause that followed. "If you please, ma'am," she began timidly, "if 'tisn't dinner time yet, mayn't I go down into the kitchen and ask cook to give me something to eat? I'm so hungry." "Bless your dear heart, 'course you're hungry, and it's little enough I can give ye," cried Mrs. McGinnis, hurrying over to the cupboard and beginning to put a few cracked dishes on the bare, not-over-clean table. "There's bread and a cold frankfurter, but that ain't no supper for the likes of you. But such as 'tis, you're welcome. And I didn't even help ye off with your pretty hat," she added self-accusingly, as she saw Margaret tugging at the white ties under her chin. "You are perfectly excusable," choked Margaret in her very politest manner. Then, to the consternation of all concerned, she burst into a storm of tears and sank to the floor. The strange people, the stranger place, the questioning, the dear mother who was nowhere to be found, so crushing an accumulation of woe was too much even for the daughter of a soldier, and at the last straw the brave little soul went down in defeat. It was a long cry, and a tempestuous one, and Bobby and his mother were at their wits' end before it ceased. Then, after a supper of very dry bread and very sour milk, Margaret went to bed on the mattress in one corner of the room, not forgetting to kneel with clasped hands for a reverent "Now I lay me down to sleep." Long after Margaret in one corner and Bobby in another were in the land of dreams, Mrs. McGinnis sat thinking. Before her mind's eye was a little red farmhouse on a hill where had lived a sweet-faced woman at whose knee she herself had said the same, "Now I lay me down to sleep." But that was years and years ago, long before she had run away with handsome young McGinnis, the hired man of the farm. And as Mrs. McGinnis in the attic room sat thinking, two men in a hospital many blocks distant met at the head of a stairway. "Has she regained consciousness?" asked one. "No, and when she does, I doubt if it will do us much good. She'll not be the same, I fear." "And was there nothing about her to tell who she is?" "Nothing, at least no name. Her clothing was of the finest cut and texture, and everywhere was the monogram AWK, but that's all." "And was there no purse, no shopping bag?" "No. She must have had one, for she had evidently just made a purchase, an insignificant something that gave no clue to her identity. She was a stranger to the clerk that sold it, as we found upon investigating the firm name on the wrapping paper. The package was still in her hand, but the purse or bag must have dropped as she fell. She is evidently a person of some means and consequence, and I should think would be missed, and ought to be easily traced. Still, if she's a stranger in town, that may complicate matters." Too bad, too bad. I fear there'll be anxious hearts somewhere tonight. Bad case, too, isn't it?" "Yes, 3 fractures, a bad cut on the head, and I fear internal injuries besides. It's a question whether she ever comes out of it at all, or not." Too bad, muttered the man again, as he turned away. End of Chapter 3. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 4 of Cross Currents. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. The grey morning light had scarcely penetrated the little attic tenement when Mrs. McGinnis shook her son's arm. Bobby, wake up," she urged in a hoarse whisper. "Run down to old Nancy's and see if you can borrow a little milk. That baby's got to have something fit to eat this morning." Bobby stirred sleepily. The next instant he had sprung to his feet at the sound of a heavy tread on the stairs outside. "Golly, if it ain't Dad," he muttered as the door banged open. The woman did not speak, but she shrank back into the shadows. Over in the other corner a blue-eyed child with rumpled yellow curls awoke and sat up with a frightened cry. "Got anything to eat?" snarled the man, slamming the door behind him and shuffling into the room. "Hello? Who are you?" he demanded as his bleared gaze fell on the little girl in the corner. Margaret was thoroughly frightened. Her dazed brain was just beginning to grasp her surroundings. Then, with a rush, memory came to her, and she made a desperate effort to be her father's own daughter.
Good morning,"
she faltered.
"If you please, sir, I'm Margaret."
Grunted the man thickly. "Well, what are you doing here?"
"Jack, don't,"
begged the woman, starting forward. "You're half drunk. Let the child alone." "Shut up," growled the man with an oath. "Hain't I got a right to speak in my own house? Come, what are you doing here?" he added, turning again to the girl.
If you please, I'm company," choked Margaret. "But I'm not going to stay long. Truly, I'm not. I'm just certain Mother'll come after me today."
"Well, she will if she knows what's good for her," retorted the man. Then his eyes fell on the broad-brimmed hat with its blue ribbon. "Oh-ho! So these are the fine feathers my pretty bird wears." He chuckled disagreeably as he caught up the hat and held it on a level with his eyes. "Looky here," he snapped, turning to his wife with a quick change of manner. "What's all this tomfoolery mean?"
"Why, Jack, it's only a poor little girl that got lost, and her mother—"
Mrs. McGinnis paused helplessly.
"Here, Mumsy, let me tell him,"
cut in Bobby, going close to his father's side and whispering a few hurried words in the man's ear. As McGinnis listened, his face relaxed. A slow cunning came to his eyes and an evil smile to his lips. "Humph!" he grunted, after a momentary pause. "Well, I reckon then there ain't nothing to prevent my making the most of these." And he gathered into his arms the hat, the black silk coat, the dainty little shoes, and the pretty white dress.
"Jack, what do you mean? You wouldn't pawn them?"
screamed the woman, darting to his side and clutching at the garments in his hands. "Wouldn't I?" sneered the man, pushing her off roughly. "Well, you just wait and see."
"But her mother, her friends, if they should find her—"
"Well, as near as I can make out, her mother won't be showing up here yet awhile, and—" A scream from Margaret interrupted.
"You brute!"
cried the woman, hurrying across the room and taking the child in her arms.
"How could ye tell her like that?"
"That's right. Pet her and coddle her. She's used to it, I'll be bound," jeered the man. "But I'll reckon she'll find out now quick enough that life ain't all sugar plums. As for her fine friends, let 'em come. I'll show 'em what living is for the most of us. And as for this finery here, I reckon a hard-luck story about an extreme outdoor feed'll fix that all right, eh?" he finished with a grin. McGinnis was in better spirits than he had been in 5 minutes before. He could afford to joke a little. Did he not know that another hour would find him once more at little Mike's, and with the pleasant jingle of coins in his pocket?
"You are going to keep her, then?"
gasped the woman. "Sure, why not? She ain't good for much now, but she's growing. And even now I reckon she could sew on buttons and earn a penny or two for a poor old man like me. I hear Sullivan wants a couple more kids. I'll speak to him."
"Jack!"
shuddered the woman, tightening her clasp on the sobbing little girl in her arms.
"You wouldn't put her there? It would kill her. She ain't used to such work."
"Well, she will be 'fore I get through with her," drawled the man. Then he whined mockingly. "What would ye have a poor hard-working man do that's just taken in an extra mouth to feed?" The next moment, with an oath and a jeering laugh, he was gone. It was not an easy half-hour that Bobby and his mother spent then. There was no quieting the little Margaret until some explanation of the man's words had been given, and at last Mrs. McGinnis was forced to tell her that they feared her mother had fallen ill and would not be able to come for her for some days. It was scarcely better after that, for the child sobbed and cried and refused to be comforted. Even Bobby's frequent reference to the soldier father served but to make the sobs more prolonged. At last, however, tired nature conquered, and the child forgot her sorrow in sleep. It was then that Mrs. McGinnis laid her guest gently down on the mattress and crossed the room to an old bureau. From the lower drawer she took out a faded, carefully mended little dress, valueless save to the mother eyes that had seen it worn by the dear little daughter long since dead.
"She's just Mary Ellen's size,"
murmured the woman with a sob in her voice. "And I'm going to let her have it.
though I thought once I wouldn't never let anyone wear it again.
End of Chapter 4, read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 5 of Cross Currents by Eleanor Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. In spite of the kind-hearted efforts of Mrs. McGinnis, Margaret was set to work at once. First, however, she was clothed in a faded blue dress, much to her surprise, and not quite to her pleasure. She tried to be politely interested, nevertheless, when Mrs. McGinnis explained that it was her own little girl's dress and that she wanted Margaret to wear it. Margaret said that the dress was very nice, thank you, but she wondered all the while where her own was. True to his word, Jack McGinnis spoke to Sullivan. He met the man on the way from the pawn-shop, and Sullivan said he would be very glad to take on another kid. Sullivan lived in another attic room just around the corner. It was a larger room, to be sure, but that was well, for there were so many people in it. First there was Mrs. Sullivan on a bed in a corner. She was not good for much, so Sullivan said, and the baby certainly was a dead loss. Still, there were times when the cough would give the sick woman long enough respite to enable her to baste together a pair of trousers or a coat. And the baby, of course, would grow. Then there were the other thin-faced, hollow-chested little Sullivans. They could work, all 7 of them, even down to the little 4-year-old. She could pull bastings. But even in his children, Sullivan was not a little disappointed. And already the eldest girl had fainted away twice at her work. All these, together with Sullivan, lived in the attic room both day and night. But during the day there were still others present. Men, women, boys, and girls, perched on broken chairs and boxes, or sitting Turk-fashion on the floor. For how else could Sullivan send out the great piles of finished garments every week? The few cents he paid for the children's labor were greedily welcomed by the parents, and he had no trouble in keeping the room as full of little helpers as he pleased, and he pleased to keep it very full indeed, for the more workers he had, the more money and leisure there followed for himself. It was to this room that Margaret was introduced. Jack McGinnis himself brought her, and said that he would call for her and for her wages at night. Then he turned and hurried away down to little Mike's. Margaret looked about her with wonder-filled eyes. McGinnis had told her that she was going to be taken where there were lots of little boys and girls, and that she might play with them all day. To Margaret it was a very strange-looking playroom. Still she did not wish to be impolite, so she smiled and said, "Thank you," when Sullivan led her to a small box for a seat and handed her a needle all threaded. Sullivan laughed at the "thank you" and winked at a man over in the corner. Then he thrust into Margaret's lap a great pair of trousers and handed her a little box of buttons. "Here, show the kid," he snapped to a big girl at Margaret's side.
"Oh, I know," cried Margaret gleefully. "I've played this before."
"Huh?" returned Sullivan in some surprise. "Oh, ye have ye?"
"Yes, it's stringing buttons. I like that, but they are all black buttons. I should prefer pretty ones. If you have them, please."
And she smiled winsomely. Sullivan swore under his breath. Then he said a few sharp words to the girl at Margaret's side. "Look-a-here," he said sternly to Margaret herself. "You find ye don't string but one at a time. Do you hear? One at a time, and ye'll take what I give ye." With flushed cheeks and trembling fingers, Margaret set to work, and tried to do as she was bid. But the thread knotted and finally broke, and the tiny holes in the button seemed almost impossible to find. At last, however, the task was accomplished, and Margaret viewed with no little pride her handiwork. Confident now of her proficiency, she politely declined any further help from the big girl, and set about sewing on the next button alone. It was just here, however, that Margaret came to grief. Supposing that to secure the button fast to the cloth was success enough in itself, she paid scant attention to location, the result being that the next button she held up in triumph was found to be adorning the left trouser leg a little above the hem. Sullivan swore again, this time not under his breath. "Look-a-here," he snarled. "Them buttons ought to be sewed on where this girl tells ye to. There you bear. Now mind, no more fooling." Margaret gazed up at the man with round eyes of wonder. This certainly was the most curious playing she had ever known. She was very sure, too, that she did not like it. She made up her mind that she would tell Mr. McGinnis that she did not care to play with these little boys and girls tomorrow. Very patiently, however, she picked up once more the needle, the thread, and the button, which the girl had ripped off, and set once again to work. But the thread knotted, the buttons dropped on the floor, and the needle pricked her fingers until a bright red drop splashed on the coarse cloth in her lap. "I don't think I'll play any more, thank you, today," faltered Margaret then, trying very hard to remember that soldiers' daughters do not cry, and she tucked the heavy trousers across the room and laid them in Sullivan's lap. "Hey, what?" demanded the man. Then he suddenly understood. "Oh, you don't? Well, I reckon I've got a word or two myself to say on that subject." And he picked up the work and dragged the child back to his seat. It was not long then before Margaret understood this was no game. In games one was not scowled at or scolded if one did not play right. She did ask timidly if it were that kindergarten place that her mother said she would soon go to, but the laugh that greeted her question hurt Margaret's dignity sorely, and after that she said but little, watching with frightened eyes those about her and trying her best to do exactly as she was bid. Margaret's first day as an employee was certainly not a success. But then, the first day of a 5-year-old seldom was. Sullivan, however, was not discouraged. He knew the second day would be better, and it was. When one knows that one's knuckles will be sharply rapped, one does not lose so many buttons, nor tie so many knots in one's thread. And when one knows that one will be awakened with an angry word and a vigorous shake, one does not so readily fall asleep over one's work. End of Chapter 5, read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 6 of Cross Currents. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Cross Currents by Eleanor Porter. Chapter 6. The long hospital ward was very quiet. A white-capped nurse at the far end was writing something on the card over one of the beds, and another one was rearranging a pillow under an aching head. Suddenly there rang out a single word, incisive and full of anguished terror. "Margaret!" The two nurses exchanged glances. "Poor dear," sighed one. "She's been quieter of late. I hoped she wouldn't have any more of those turns." "So did I," said the other in a low voice, as she went quickly to the sufferer's bed. Once there, however, she started in amazement. The beautiful white-faced woman was sitting straight up in bed. There was no light or feverish delirium in the wide-open blue eyes, only terror and agonized questioning. At the first glance the nurse knew that she was looking straight into the eyes of a perfectly sane woman, a woman who for weeks had been the unsolved mystery of the hospital. "Where am I? How did I come to be here?" demanded the woman imperiously.
"What have you done with Margaret?"
There, there, if you'll lie down, soothed the nurse tremulously. But she could say no more.
"I can't lie down. I must know at once. Where is Margaret?"
You have been ill, madam. You were injured, stammered the nurse. You were brought here to the hospital and— A sharp cry interrupted the words.
"Margaret! I left her in the station with Miss Darrell. It all comes back to me now. The dear child, she'll be so frightened. I must go to her at once. Quick, where are my clothes? Please."
No, no, you are too ill. Madam, I beg of you, cried the nurse, putting out two restraining hands.
"But I must,
Something in the nurse's face stayed the words on her lips. A new horror came to her eyes.
"Nurse, how long have I been here?"
she breathed. For an instant there was absolute silence. Then something entirely outside the nurse's control forced the words from her lips. 2 months, madam. Even as she spoke, the tense muscles of the woman in her arm relaxed, and the long lashes swept the white cheeks. The woman had fainted. Long before Mrs. Kendall was well enough to leave the hospital, the whole vast machinery of the city detective force was set in motion. First, there had been a weary search for Miss Darrell, a search that led across land and sea, and finally ended in bitter disappointment. For Miss Darrell, shocked and well-nigh heartbroken over the news of Margaret's loss, could only confess that she had hurried away and left the child alone that day long ago in the Grand Central Station. In New York itself could nowhere be found a trace of the yellow-haired little maid in the black silk coat. The great city seemed to have swallowed her up. The half-frantic mother was in despair, but at the earliest possible moment she took up the search herself. It seemed to her that she certainly would win, even though so many before her had failed. She went first to the Grand Central Station and forced herself to enter the waiting room, though her eyes were blinded with tears, and though her knees shook under her so that she could scarcely stand. Not until she questioned the matron of the women's waiting room did she find anyone who had any recollection of a yellow-haired, blue-eyed little girl in a black silk coat sitting all alone. "Yes, ma'am, I remember her well," said the matron respectfully. "And a right pretty behaved child she was, ma'am. I even spoke to her, and she answered up as pretty as you please that she was waiting for her mother."
Yes, the darling,"
choked Mrs. Kendall behind her veil. "It must have been she.
And then?"
And then, why, there wasn't anything then, as I know of. You see, it seemed all straight to me, as long as she said she was waiting for her mother, and I left her. When I looked again, she wasn't there." A low moan came from behind the black veil. For a moment no one spoke. Then the matron began hesitatingly. "There was a little scrap of paper with some writing on it found in the big waiting room about that time, and it was brought to me. I kept it 'cause it was such a queer little thing. It has just occurred to me that it might have been found that day your little girl was here, and maybe she wrote it. I'll get it anyhow." Half an hour later, a slender, black-gowned woman walked out of the Grand Central Station with unsteady steps. The eyes behind the black veil were red with weeping, and one black-gloved hand held fast a scrap of brown wrapping paper on which had been half-printed, half-written, a note signed, "Your affectionate daughter, Margaret."
"If only there was some clue to tell who the boy was,"
moaned the grief-stricken mother that night as she paced her room in the hotel.
"If only I knew whether he were good and kind. And she was so hungry, the poor darling. Yet she would not leave without a message to me. 'Twas so like her, so like her."
There was no cessation in the search during the days that followed. There was not an institution in the city where a stray child might be taken, that was not visited by a sad-faced woman dressed in black who insisted upon personally interviewing every child that had been brought in during the past 5 months. Time and money were of no consequence, and the most elusive of clues was patiently followed until it was proved beyond a doubt to have no bearing on the case in hand. Not until there were no more clues to follow, and no more ways to turn, did Mrs. Kendall finally go back to the little town where Margaret had been born, and where stood the house with the great stone lions on either side of the steps. End of Chapter 6. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 7 of Cross Currents. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. All Houghtonsville was interested in the new doctor, and all Houghtonsville liked his appearance. The old men saw his square jaw, noted his steady hand and eye, and said that he was skillful. The young men met the genial smile and strong hand-clasp, and said that he was a good fellow. The old women watched his quiet strength and ease of manner and said that he was sympathetic. The young women noted his breadth of shoulder and length of limb and said nothing. But they smiled into his eyes and made him frankly welcome. Almost immediately after Dr. Spencer's arrival, the old physician, Dr. Kent, whose assistant he had come to be, met with a severe accident. And all through the long weeks of the old man's slow convalescence, the young man found the love and allegiance that had been given to the elder physician extended as by common consent to himself. It touched him profoundly, and already the clasp of his hand carried something of the spirit of possession. These are my people, it seemed to say. Dr. Spencer had been 2 months in Houghtonsville when there came the summons to go to the old Kendall place, the great house of the town. "Ever been thar?" asked old Nathan as they drove down the wide elm-bordered street. Nathan had held the reins over the old doctor's horses for nearly 40 years, and he, as well as the love and allegiance, had fallen to the lot of the younger physician. Indeed, Houghtonsville would scarcely have recognized the doctor as a man of healing at all had not old Nathan brought him. "No, I've never been there," returned the doctor. Fine place." "So I judge from the outside." Silence reigned for a minute, but as the doctor well knew, it would not reign for long. At first he had tried to check Nathan's somewhat garrulous tongue, but he soon found that that very tongue was of valuable assistance to him in making his diagnoses. What he learned about the patient on the way frequently made wonderfully clear what he learned from the patient after he arrived. As he suspected in this particular case, he had not a long to wait. "She's a widow, Miss Kendall is," observed Nathan musingly. "Yes?" Husband been dead, let's see, 6 years. It's been more'n 2 years, since the little gal was lost. You knew about that, I suppose." "Lost? Little girl?" There was interest in the doctor's voice, and old Nathan settled back in his seat with a sigh of content. "Yes, 'twas in New York. She left the little thing in the depot while she went out on a errand. She got knocked down in the street and was sick for most 3 or 4 months, I guess. When she come back, course the little gal wasn't there, and she hain't seen hide nor hair of her since." "The poor woman!" exclaimed the physician under his breath. "I wonder she kept her reason." "Some say she hain't. Ever seen her?" "No, not that I know of." "You'd know it all right if you had. There ain't 2 round here that looks like her. For that matter, there ain't many that has seen her lately. When she come back that first time from New York, she shut herself right up in that house and hain't hardly stirred out of it since, 'cept to go to New York. She goes thar 2 or 3 times a year,
And they do say she goes to that depot and sets in that seat where she left the little gal, and sets there with her eyes on the door. Kind of odd now, ain't it? Do you suppose she expects that child to come back after all this time?"
"I don't know, Nathan," said the other gravely. Then he asked, "But does she live alone? Isn't there anyone that she loves?"
"There don't seem to be, Doctor," returned Nathan, flicking off a fly with the left rein. "There ain't nobody in the house but old Tim Barrett and his wife, and they do all that's done, both outside and in. She must have been powerfully sick to send for ye. They hain't let a soul get further in that little room off the hall that they call a reception room for years. There was a time when folks called and tried to show their sympathy and be sociable. But land sakes, they don't do that no more. The only one they ever see was old Miss Barrett, and she allers said the same thing until they learned it by heart. 'My mistress is indisposed and begs to be excused.' Of course, there warn't no getting very sociable on that."
"How she must have suffered, poor thing."
"Yes, ain't it too bad?" retorted Nathan. "They do say as how there's a room that used to belong to the little gal, and that was all full of her things, and that now they're exactly as they was left years ago, and that the door ain't never shut. You see, they warn't home much the last year. Miss Kendall, she got restless, and they was cutting off here and there and everywhere. The last time they left the house together, they went kind of sudden, so the story goes, and the little gal's playthings were scattered round, and nobody stopped to pick 'em up, and Miss Kendall went right off and closed the house. When she come back, 'twas after the whole thing had happened, and she looked like a shadder. Well, she went into the house, and there was them things, and there they've been ever since, and here we be ourselves,"
he finished cheerfully, as he drew up before the huge stone lions on either side of the steps at Five Oaks. A grey-haired, bent old woman answered the doctor's ring.
"Come in, sir, come in,"
she half whispered, and the doctor noticed that she shook as if frightened. "You sent for me?" he asked gently.
"Yes, doctor."
And this time the old woman's teeth fairly chattered.
"It's my mistress, sir. She's not well. I would have sent for you before, but she wouldn't let me."
"And now?"
"She don't know, sir. She's not right in her head," faltered the old woman. "I made bold myself to send for you."
"You did quite right," said the man gravely. "Where is she?"
"This way, sir. Come,"
replied the woman, leading the way through the hall and stairs. The house had the chill and cheerlessness of a tomb. Everywhere were closed doors and drawn shades, everywhere save at the turn of the hall upstairs. There a door was wide open, and showed the afternoon sun shining upon a little woolly dog in the middle of the floor. Very hurriedly, and with a furtive glance at her companion, the woman passed by this door. The next instant she had pushed open another door near by, and had motioned him to enter. The sick room, too, was in the semi-twilight of drawn blinds, and for a moment the doctor could make nothing out distinctly. He crossed to the window, swung back the blinds, and turned towards the bed. Even the near-sighted old woman noticed his start of surprise. Amy Kendall had been 19 when Margaret was born. She looked scarcely more than that now to the doctor, with her two heavy braids of golden hair trailing over her shoulders. But a nearer view of the wasted form, the thin cheeks, and the drawn mouth told of the havoc that the last 2 years had wrought. She was looking straight into his eyes, and unconsciously the doctor shivered. Then he advanced to the bed, and laid cool, firm fingers on the slender wrist lying outside the coverlet. It was a hard fight and a long one, but in the end the doctor won. It took many a sleepless night, however, and many an anxious day, and the way by the room where the woolly dog in the sunshine became quite worn with the frequent passing of the doctor's feet. At last one day the blue eyes of the sick woman opened and turned upon him, rational, questioning, displeased. " You are a physician." " Yes, Mrs. Kendall. My name is Spencer." " Who sent for you ?"" Your faithful servant first. Afterwards I came of my own accord because it was necessary." " But I forbade her to do it." " And she obeyed, until you were so ill she had to call me." The golden head on the pillow stirred restlessly. " She should not have done it, even then." " But, my dear Mrs. Kendall, you were desperately ill. You might have died." There was a slight pause. Then a low, distinct voice came from the bed. " That is exactly why she should not have done it. I might have died." For the first shocked instant the young man made no reply. Then his lips parted, only to close again almost as quickly. The next moment his whole expression changed. " If you will drink this now, Mrs. Kendall," he said cheerily, " then I'll be going." 3 minutes later he softly crossed the room and opened the hall door. End of Chapter XVII, read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter VIII of Cross Currents. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. As early as possible in Mrs. Kendall's convalescence, the doctor was told that his services were no longer required. The trained nurse, too, was dismissed, and once more the silence of the darkened hall and chambers was undisturbed. To Houghtonsville things seemed as of old. To Dr. Spencer they did not. Always now before his mental gaze was a slender, black-gowned figure with sad blue eyes, and always not far away was a little woolly dog with the sunlight upon it. So vivid was all this to his mind's eye that for a moment he still thought it a vision when one day in New York he saw the same slender, black-gowned woman in the Grand Central Station. The next minute he had crossed to the woman's side. " Good afternoon, Mrs. Kendall. You are going home? May I not be of some assistance to you?" " Thank you, no, Dr. Spencer. I am not going home at present." Voice and manner were a cold dismissal, and the doctor had no choice but to lift his hat and walk away. But he did not go far. 3 times during the next half-hour he passed through the waiting-room, and each time he saw nothing but the black-gowned woman sitting alone on one of the seats. The 4th time he entered the room, he crossed once more to her side. "Mrs. Kendall, I beg of you. You are not strong yet. Will you not let me take you home?" "I am quite well, doctor. I need no assistance, and I am not ready to go home. Surely I do not need to say more." There was a moment's silence. Then the doctor lifted his chin. "I understand, Mrs. Kendall, of course. Yet in the face of that I am going to make one more effort to save you from yourself. You can do no possible good by remaining here, and you are only bringing additional suffering to yourself and your friends. Mrs. Kendall, I beg of you, will you not come with me?" The woman stirred restlessly. "Dr. Spencer, you must know that you are annoying me. Why do you persist? There is no one that can be injured by my doing as I please. There is no one that has a right to interfere." "I'm not so sure of that," said the man gently. "I have found that no one lives to himself alone." "You are right," returned the woman with sudden bitterness. "They are not alone. No one is as I am. Look there, and there, and there," she continued in a low voice, glancing from one to another of the groups about them. "They have children. 1, 2, even 4 or 5. I had a child once, doctor. One little ewe lamb, and she was taken from me. Now I have not even a grave to weep over. Even that is denied me. And yet you would take from me this one poor comfort I have left. This is my Margaret's grave, the place where I caught the last glimpse of my darling's face. It is my right to come here. It is my right to grieve as I please. Now will you go?" There was no tremor in the low voice, no sob. There was only the concentrated bitterness of long years of silent rebellion. Never had Mrs. Kendall so bared her heart to any human eye. "Yes, I will go," said the man gravely for a moment, then held out his hand. "Forgive me for my unwelcome intrusion on your grief, Mrs. Kendall, and believe me, there is no one in the whole wide world that so deeply sympathizes with you. If at any time I can be of any service to you, I shall be only too glad. Good afternoon and good-bye." Over in the next row of seats a young girl's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. She had been watching for some time the heavily veiled woman and the earnest-faced, good-looking young man talking together, and now as the man turned away she saw that the woman had risen and impulsively hurried after him. The girl saw the black-gloved hand laid for a moment on the man's coat-sleeve, and she saw the glad light leap to the man's eyes. But she did not hear the low-spoken words that came to the man's ears. "Forgive me, Dr. Spencer. I was unkind and unjust to speak as I did. I do appreciate your kindness, and I do thank you for your sympathy." "And you'll come home," suggested the man eagerly. She flushed and drew back. "Not that. Not today. Don't ask me to do that," she begged. "But I'll come. Soon. I'll promise to come soon." Back in the seat across the way the young girl felt vaguely disappointed. The black-gowned woman had come back and sat down, while the good-looking man had gone away alone. The girl would have willed it otherwise. It must have been a week later that the doctor's mare stopped once again before the great stone lions of Five Oaks. "May I see your mistress a moment?" asked the doctor of the old woman who answered his ring. The man tried to speak as if it were an everyday occurrence, this morning call, but the woman made no secret of her surprise as she answered. "But, doctor, you know her orders. She sees no one." "Yes, I know," frowned the man, "but I'll take the risk this time. Just tell her, please, that I asked you to give her my name." "Thank you," he added as the woman turned away. 3 minutes later she returned with amazement still written on her face. "Mrs. Kendall will be down directly," she murmured, and almost immediately the doctor heard a light step on the stairs. "I don't know why I consent to this, Dr. Spencer," said Mrs. Kendall with a faint smile as she entered the reception-room, "unless it is that I'm still repentant for my rude words of a week ago." The doctor raised a deprecatory hand. "It was I who was rude, I fear," he returned, "and now I am about to trespass still further on your kindness. I have come to ask a favor." "A favor?" The doctor saw and understood the quick stiffening of the slight figure before him. "Yes," he said hurriedly. "Mrs. Merton up on the hill yonder is in great trouble. She has asked to see you. Will you go?" The tense muscles relaxed and Mrs. Kendall sank weakly into a chair. "Doctor, how can you ask me?" she cried, with more than a touch of irritation in her voice. "You know I cannot go." The doctor was silent. "I never make calls or receive them," she finished a bit sharply. "I understand," murmured the doctor in a low voice, "and I fully realize my transgression. The nature of my errand must be my excuse." "But I never even heard of this Mrs. Merton," objected Mrs. Kendall restlessly. "Doctor, can't you see? It is quite out of the question. What is she to me, or I to her? Why can I not be left in peace? Why need I drag my sorrow before the world?" For a moment there was no reply. Then the doctor said gently, "Mrs. Kendall, a week ago I said to you that no one lives quite to himself. May I tell you a story?" Mrs. Kendall frowned and looked sharply into the doctor's face. "Well?" she said after a minute, not very graciously. "Thank you," bowed the man gravely. Then he turned his eyes towards a swaying bare tree branch outside the window and began in a low voice. "Some years ago there was in this town a woman with an only daughter." Mrs. Kendall stirred and half rose from her chair, but the man did not seem to notice, and at his next words she fell back to her old position. This girl grew to young womanhood, sweet, pretty, and lovable. To her mother she was the one bright spot in a rather dull world, the one object about which centered all her hopes and ambitions. At 18, the girl ran away from home with a man named McGinnis, who had worked on the farm. That was the last ever heard from her. The mother lived, and today lives crippled on a bed of great pain. A week ago her husband died, leaving her quite alone in the world. That mother is the woman that sent for you today. She says there is just one woman in the world whose face she wants to see, whose sympathy she craves, who will quite understand. The doctor's voice trailed into silence. His eyes were still fixed on the bare tree branch outside the window. There was a long pause. Then Mrs. Kendall rose to her feet. "I will be ready in 5 minutes, doctor," she said in a low voice, and she left the room. "Thank God," breathed the doctor softly, as he watched the slender figure disappear down the long hall. "It will be a beginning at least." End of Chapter VIII. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter IX. Of Cross Currents. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. It was indeed a beginning. For the first time in 3 years, Mrs. Kendall allowed her thoughts to rest on some grief other than her own, and for the first time in her life she came in contact with misery and want. The shock was great, and it awoke her to sudden action. The peculiar circumstances of the case made it particularly appealing. The long, lonely years spent by that other mother, waiting, always waiting. How well she knew them. The vast, soundless space into which that other daughter had stepped. How well she knew that, too. No longer did Mrs. Kendall spend all her days in darkened chambers or in crying over a woolly dog in the sunlight. She gave some of these days now to a lonely old woman in the little red farmhouse. And with these visits of Mrs. Kendall's came comforts such as the farmhouse had never known. Books, flowers, fruit, and a good nurse whose touch was wonderfully soothing to the poor old bones so long used to unskilful handling. But even better than all this were the long talks in the twilight, when mother spoke to mother, and when two burdened hearts met on common ground. Nor was this all. From the very first Mrs. Kendall had exerted herself to find trace of the young girl who long ago had run away with the man named McGinnis. It is true she met with little success, for the young people had covered their tracks well, and even the direction they had taken was not known. The doctor too joined in the search, and he was also unrewarded. Unless he chose to consider the new light in Mrs. Kendall's eye and the new flush on Mrs. Kendall's cheek as such, the doctor was certainly feeling very thankful these days over something. It had been 2 months since Mrs. Kendall's first visit to the farmhouse when the letter bearing the New York postmark came to Mrs. Merton. "Read it, Miss Kendall, please, ma'am," begged the sick woman. "I want never much hand to read writing, and I can't think who'd be writing to me." Mrs. Kendall tore open the letter and glanced at the signature. Then all the color fled from her face, only to come back the next instant in a rosy flood. "Mrs. Merton, it's signed Sadie," she faltered. "Sadie, Sadie, Sadie, my own Sadie. Read it, oh, read it, quick, Miss Kendall. Why, it's Sadie, my little girl," cried Mrs. Merton, sobbing for joy. "Dear mother," began Mrs. Kendall in a tremulous voice, "I don't know as I ought to call you that now, for maybe you don't want me no more as a daughter. But I want you, and I hain't never stopped wantin' you. Even at the first I was homesick, but I was too proud to go back. Jack is dead now, and I want to come home. Will you take me in? I forgot most of all I knew about writing, and I can't tell you how I feel. But if you let me come, I can talk. There's the boy, too,
You like Bobby. You'll be proud of him, I'm thinking. You'd have been proud, too, of my poor little Mary Ellen if she'd lived. But she's gone now. May I come? I ain't well, Mother, and I want to get Bobby home to you before I can't, you know. Maybe you ain't living, but somehow I think you are. I've always thought of you as being just the same smart, spry, and so good to me. And, Mother, do you mind? I want to say, now I lay me down to sleep once more at your knee, just as I used to. I wanted to ever since I heard that little girl say it 3 years ago. Such a pretty little girl with big blue eyes and yellow curls that Bobby found crying in the street one night. Her poor mother had been run over. The shaking voice stopped suddenly, and the eager eyes swept the sheet of paper to the bottom. Then a joy-crazed woman fell on her knees by the bed. "Mrs. Merton, it's both our children. It's your baby and mine. We found them both. We found them both." And down went the golden head on the pillow beside the one crowned with the silver of years. Later the letter was read again. There was not much that Mrs. Merton had not heard, merely a line or two about the little girl having been left all alone in the station, a loving message or two, and the signature. But every syllable was precious beyond comparison to the two mothers. Later still, Mrs. Kendall found herself en route for New York. Just how it had all been accomplished Mrs. Kendall could not tell. She had an idea, however, that the man across the aisle in the parlor car could have told, for it was he who had attended to tickets, trains, and seats, he who had seen to procuring a nurse to accompany them, saying that Mrs. McGinnis might need her on the return trip, and it was he who, almost as excited as Mrs. Kendall herself, was now hurrying to New York with her to bring the wanderers home. Certainly Mrs. Kendall did not know what she would have done without the doctor. It was nearly midnight when New York was reached, and there was nothing for them to do but to go to the hotel, for in spite of her impatience Mrs. Kendall well knew that it was too late for anything else to be done that night. She tried to sleep. She told herself that she needed rest for the morrow, but always before her eyes was the blue-eyed, yellow-haired little girl she had left in the station so long ago, and always there was a flood of questions that had no answer. Would Margaret know her mother? Had she forgotten her? What had those 3 years brought to her? Had she suffered? Had she been unhappy? Had she ever been hungry? Mrs. Kendall shuddered and clenched her fingers until the nails bit into the palms of her hands at the thought. There was no time lost in the morning, and at the earliest possible Mrs. Kendall, the doctor, and the nurse were on their way to the address given in Sadie's letter. As the streets grew narrower and dirtier, and the houses poorer, Mrs. Kendall's distress and horror found expression in shuddering glances and exclamations, and when the long dark stairs that led to the attic tenement were reached, she moaned, "Oh, doctor, how she must have suffered! How she must have suffered, my poor darling!" There was scarcely a word of introduction or explanation after Mrs. Guinness had opened the door, before Mrs. Kendall spoke. The mother love and patience had been strained to the breaking point, and would not longer be held in check. Sweeping the poor little room with eager eyes, Mrs. Kendall cried, "The little blue-eyed, yellow-haired girl that came to you 3 years ago, where is she? Where is she?" The woman opposite looked dazed and frightened. She shook her head. "I don't know, madam," she said. "You don't know?" "No, madam. She didn't stay but a week, and I've never seen her since." There was a low, sobbing cry. "Quick! Quick, some water!" cried the doctor sharply, as he caught Mrs. Kendall's swaying form. "She is faint." End of Chapter 9. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 10 of Cross Currents,
This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. When Mrs. McGinnis had said that Margaret had stayed with her but a week, she had told the truth, but not the whole truth. She had said nothing whatever about the cause of Margaret's leaving, and for the mother's peace of mind it was perhaps just as well. For a week Jack McGinnis had piloted Margaret to and from old Sullivan's sweatshop every day. In vain had Mrs. McGinnis pleaded in Margaret's behalf. McGinnis was obdurate, and the poor little woman, always in terror of her husband, could do nothing. Once she had vaguely wondered if it would be possible to trace the woman that Bobby had seen run down by the big touring car. But she dismissed the thought instantly with a shiver of dread. There was Jack to be thought of, and there were the pawned clothes. Besides, Bobby had said that the woman was surely dead. He had heard a man say so. It would do no good, therefore, even were she willing to face the consequences of any of the little girl's friends finding her in a present unhappy plight. Notwithstanding all this, however, Mrs. McGinnis was determined that in some way, Margaret should be rescued. Until that time came, the most she could do was to make the little girl's life outside Sullivan's attic as bearable as possible. To that end she petted and soothed the child all that she could, and bound up the poor little pricked fingers every night. It was one morning, just a week after Margaret's arrival, that McGinnis walked into his attic tenement crazed with drink, and it was while he was raging round the room brandishing a chair over his head that Margaret had become thoroughly frightened and had flung open the door and dashed down the stairs into the street. When she tried to go back later, she could not find the way. Once more the weary little feet tramped the streets, and the blue eyes looked fearfully out from beneath a tangle of golden curls. Now, however, there was no black silk coat nor flower-trimmed hat, and the golden hair was rough with a week's neglect. It was Sullivan who found her crying in a doorway.
Well, if it ain't McGinnis's company,"
he cried, peering into the little girl's face, and giving her the name by which Jack McGinnis had gleefully introduced her, in accordance with Margaret's own assertion on that first morning that she was company.
"What's the matter, eh?"
Margaret shrank back. This was the man that scolded when one went to sleep, and that rapped one's fingers when one's buttons were not properly sewed on. And yet he was the only one that could show her the way back to the woman with the kind voice and loving eyes. With a supreme effort, Margaret choked back her sobs and drew herself erect. "If you please, sir, I'm lost," she faltered.
"Lost?"
"Yes, thank you." And she told him the story of her flight from the McGinnis tenement. Sullivan listened attentively. Then he smiled with half-shut eyes and picked her up in his arms.
"And I reckon you'll be for comin' home with me then, and be my little gal,"
he said in her ear. And when Margaret screamed and struggled, he repeated soothingly,
"My little gal. I'll treat ye just like my little gal."
And he did. He paid her no wages. For 2 months Margaret was held a prisoner in the room with the 8 Sullivan children and the sick wife. Not once was she allowed on the street lest some one of the McGinnis family should see her. To tell the truth, the Sullivan children themselves were kept pretty close indoors, lest the schoolman spy them. School was a luxury for only the rich, Sullivan said, certainly not for a poor man's children who had their own daily bread to earn, and his. As for Margaret, she, like the little 4-year-old Nancy, was too young for school anyway, but she could pull bastings and sew on buttons even better than Nancy, and every little helped. Life in the Sullivan home was yet another new experience for Margaret. She had thought the room unpleasant enough in the daytime, when filled with its busy workers, but at night it became the living-room, the dining-room, and the sleeping-room of the entire Sullivan family. She found it far worse. In the McGinnis home there had been a freckle-faced boy and a gentle-handed woman to devote themselves to her comfort. Here there was no one. The man swore, the baby cried, and the woman lay back on the bed silent with exhaustion. While as for the children, half of them accepted her presence with listless indifference, the other half good-naturedly tweaked her ears and pulled her hair, a method of initiation into comradeship that Margaret could not in the least understand. Perhaps her greatest surprise came on that first night at supper-time. On the plate before her was placed a large spoonful of chopped beef and garlic and a slice of dry bread.
"Well, what are you waiting for?" demanded Sullivan as he saw she did not eat. "Maybe you don't think it's good enough for ye, eh?"
Margaret flushed painfully. Her glance fell before the angry flame in the man's eyes.
"Thank you. I'm sure it would be very enjoyable indeed," she stammered. "But I should prefer bread and milk, please. Thank you."
Margaret was not prepared for the shout that greeted her words. She was also not prepared for the onslaught made upon her plate by her right hand and her left hand neighbors. As for her, no further attention was paid to her, and she went supperless to bed. It was Margaret's first lesson, and she learned it well. She found no more fault with her food, and before the month was out she fought like the rest of the children to obtain her share of a loaf of bread or a bag of doughnuts. She did not say thank you so frequently these days, nor did she always remember to be polite when people asked her questions. A peculiar hunted look had come to her eyes, and she watched for a chance to reach the outer door unseen. She was too thoroughly cowed and frightened to make any serious disturbance, and she did her work as well as her new untrained little fingers would allow. But she grew thin and pale, and half sick with fear and despair. Sullivan was not pleased. In fact, he was keenly disappointed. He had estimated that the greater number of wageless fingers he had working for him, the better off he would be. And though so small a labourer could not be expected to make a great showing, yet every little helped, and each day made her older. He remembered the case of old Gedimen across the street. That case had not turned out like this. The boy was older than Margaret, to be sure, and when the meddlesome schoolman had learned that old Gedimen had an Italian lad working for him for nothing, the lad had been taken away at once. The blow to Gedimen had been only a temporary one, however, for he had immediately sent to Italy for another boy. And now he had two. Fortunate Gedimen! As for Margaret, she barely paid her keep now, according to Sullivan's opinion. He was weary, too, of the constant care necessary to keep her indoors and out of sight of any of the McGinnis family. He dared not risk Jack McGinnis's displeasure by letting him know where she had been all these weeks. Jack could be very virtuous on occasion. He feared, too, other complications. Someone would be hunting for the child some time. In truth, he could not and would not take the risk any longer. It was then that he took the little girl away one night and handed her over to his cousin Tom Swaney. He owed Tom a good turn, anyway, he said. Swaney made paper bags in a cellar not far from the Bowery. There were many boys and girls in Swaney's cellar, and they all pasted bags at 4 cents a thousand. They stayed there day and night, too. It was safer, Swaney said. If they should go out on the street, they might be seen and their work stopped. Yes, it was safer inside. Swaney also feared the schoolman, it seemed. Swaney himself did not like to work. Neither did his wife nor his wife's brother. But after all, they did not need to work much, for the 6 little Swaneys and the other children could turn out many, many thousand bags every week. Some of these children must be paid a few cents for their work, to be sure. But there were others concerning whom Swaney was more fortunate. His own children, Margaret, and a boy whose father had died since placing him there. Margaret thought the cellar even worse than Sullivan's attic. To begin with, it was not light. Indeed, to Margaret it seemed that the only use for the sputtering, ill-smelling lamp on the table was to show how dark the room really was. The room under her feet was littered with scraps of paper, and everywhere was a sickening odor of paste. It was here that Sullivan left her, and it was here that Margaret increased her knowledge and her earning power by learning the art of bag pasting. It was not long before Margaret found that paste and paper could be fully as unmanageable as were thread and needles at first. She found also that Swaney's raps, cuffs, and shakes were administered with even greater force and frequency than had his cousin's been. There were times when Margaret cried. Even the soldier father was powerless now to keep the tears from falling. Indeed, he was almost forgotten by his weary, frightened, perplexed little daughter. But Margaret, with a wisdom born of bitter experience, soon found that crying did no good. In time her little fingers learned to turn the pasted sheets almost automatically, and hundreds of times a day her little tiny fist came down with a thump that marked the completed bag. Margaret thought sometimes of running away. Twice she did run away, and twice she was brought back. She was not sorry, after all, for they did have something to eat in the cellar, and she was hungry. End of Chapter 10, read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 11 of Cross Currents. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Margaret was 6 years old when, for the third time, she ran away from Swaney's cellar. This time she was successful in her flight. Her wits had been sharpened by adversity. On the very first day of her freedom, she ran after an old man on the street and restored a fallen parcel.
Well, well, bless your pretty face, and did I drop it?
He cried.
Let me see.
And he thrust his hand into his pocket.
I think that's worth a dime, eh?
He finished, dropping into Margaret's palm a bright new 10-cent piece. Margaret gazed from the money to the back of the retreating man. 10 cents! And she had only picked up a tiny brown package that had been nothing at all to lift. Why, for 10 cents, back in Swaney's cellar, one might make 1,000 bags and not get half so much money, even though one were paid for it. And she had been obliged to do it for nothing. 10 cents! Margaret hugged the bit of silver, kissed it, and danced up and down with joy. Then she went to the bakery across the street and squandered half her fortune on buns. On a seat in the tiny rectangular park where 3 streets crossed, Margaret feasted on her buns and meditated on this marvelous thing that had come to her. Life might be a simple thing, after all. If picking up a bundle brought 10 cents, and half the 10 cents brought 6 great buns, this problem of living by oneself was not going to be so difficult to solve. To Margaret, the road stretched straight ahead through an endless paradise of buns and bundles. She was having her first sweet taste of the bread of independence, and it was very dear to her. Sundown brought Margaret back to earth. Even her present fortune had its limitations, and in Swaney's cellar she had had a roof over her head. It was June and warm, however, and Margaret finally found a cozy little nook behind a big pile of bales on the wharf, and there she curled herself up to sleep. In one hand was a precious 5-cent piece, in the other a paper bag holding 4 buns. Once Margaret would have been afraid of the lonely darkness with the sound of the black water lapping the piers, but now she welcomed the night, for it hid her from eyes that might be searching for her, and as for the loneliness, the fewer people one had about one, the fewer raps, cuffs, and hair-pullings one was likely to receive, in Margaret's experience. "Hello, Rags." Margaret was just beginning to stir the next morning when the strange voice and the strange salutation brought her instantly awake. With a sharp little cry she sprang to her feet, instinctively on defensive. "What do you want?" she demanded. Thrusting behind her back the 5-cent piece and the bag of buns, thus early had she awakened to a realization of the responsibility that comes with possessions. "I said, 'Hello, Rags,' and I don't want nothin'," returned a cheery voice. Margaret's hands tightened their clasp. Peering around the corner of the pile of bales was a girl several years older than herself, a girl with snapping little black eyes and a small pinched face ending in a pointed chin. Margaret had seen many boys and girls since she came to New York, but never one like this, never one with so confident an air of independence, as if the world and everything in it were hers for the asking. Already it seemed to Margaret that those keen black eyes had discovered the buns and the money, out of sight though they were. Suddenly she remembered another cause for grievance. "I ain't Rags," she said sharply. "No? No? Or maybe they's ribbons, then," jeered the stranger, still good-naturedly, her eyes on the rags and tatters that told how far from lavish had been Swaney's supply of a wardrobe. "Now I like my ribbons tied in bows," went on the little girl, "but maybe you like yours sort of loose and careless like, eh? Maybe it's new style." Margaret stared silently, her hands still held behind her back. "Say, what is your name?" asked the other. Margaret hesitated. "Why, it's Maggie now," she said slowly, or Mag. "But before it was—" She stopped. The old hunted look coming to her eyes. Even now she could hear the jeering laugh that had so often silenced her in Sullivan's attic, when she had insisted upon being called by that other name, that Margaret, which belonged to the dear long ago. It's Maggie," she finished defiantly. "Well, Maggie, then, if you like that better'n rags, where you live?" Margaret stared. She threw a quick look about her. "Well, you see, I ain't going back," she said confidentially. "So I don't live anywhere now." "Runned away? Where from?" Margaret stepped back cautiously. "You tell," she said. "Tell? Not on your life. Patty Murphy don't tattle-tale," retorted the black-eyed, thin-faced little girl loftily. "Is Patty Murphy you?" ventured Maggie with some hesitation. "At your service," bowed Patty mockingly, her eyes dancing. "Come, what do you run from?" Maggie opened her lips, but before she could speak a shrill scream came from the street. The next instant a little girl about the size of Maggie herself ran limping and stumbling down the wharf and flung herself against the girl who had just owned to the name of Patty Murphy. "He steal them! He steal them!" wailed the newcomer. "And I couldn't run! I couldn't run!" "Steal them? Not the Frankfurters?" "Yes." Patty's eyes flashed. Every muscle in her slim little body stiffened. "Who was it?" she demanded wrathfully. "I don't know. It was a boy. He don't live anywheres round here. I never see him for." Patty's tense muscles relaxed. Plainly, retribution and recovery of the stolen goods were impossible, inasmuch as the culprit was unknown. "Don't you fret, Arabella, don't you fret," she soothed, patting the little girl's heaving shoulders. "Like 'nough we'll find somethin' else for breakfast. My, but 'twas mean where he must 'a' known ye couldn't run," she cried angrily. "Ye see, it's them," she added in a low voice, turning to Maggie's and pointing to little Arabella's twisted, misshapen feet. She won't finish up right, somehow, I reckon. And they don't go good." Maggie was silent. A faint something was stirring within her, a something that had lain dormant for long months. "'Course nobody likes to lose their breakfast," went on Patty. "But there's heaps of chances yit, and—" A gleeful laugh interrupted her. "Breakfast? Why, I've got breakfast, lots of it," cried Maggie joyously. "Enough for all of us." And she tore open the bag in her hand and proudly displayed the 4 buns. "Say, you are a brick!" cried Patty, but she snatched back the hand that Arabella greedily reached toward the bag. No, Arabella, wait for Twinny. Come," she added to Maggie, "we'll get the rest of my family. You see, there's 3 of us, me and the twins. They're Arabella and Clarabella. Kind of pretty names, don't you think?" she asked as she trudged along the street. "I named 'em myself out of a piece of a book I found in a ash barrel last winter. Oh, they had names, 'course, before. Sue and Sally. But they weren't purty ones, so I changed 'em. Name is a thing you don't have to have if you don't like 'em. They ain't like measles and relations. Now, there's Dad. If I could have changed him as easy as, here, Clarabella. Come here." She called suddenly to a little girl who was almost the image of Arabella, save only that in her case the little legs were straight and the feet well-shaped. It was amazing how it throve, this friendship built on a bag of buns, but thrive it certainly did. Patty and the twins took Maggie straight to their hearts and stoutly championed her cause all through the somewhat difficult process of introducing her to life at the Alley. Hearing the story of her flight from Swaney's cellar, they expressed their unqualified approval of her conduct, openly admired her courage, and constituted themselves a bodyguard of 3 to protect her from being recaptured. They even procured from somewhere an old dress, a little less ragged than her own, and presented her with it. Realizing also that this new citizen of their community must have some means of support, they proceeded to instruct her in various arts now likely to be of use to her. Begging to be done cautiously, and with a wary eye out for the cops. Swiping to be done still more cautiously, and with a still more wary eyes out for the cops. Errand running and baby tending always to be done on the straight, but never to be done at all when anything better offered. Nor did this make the sum total of the ministrations of the 3 new friends. On the very first day of the acquaintanceship, Maggie was graciously invited to share the girls' cooperative housekeeping establishment in one corner of a basement room belonging to a good-natured woman who had taken pity on their houseless condition. "Ye see, it's this way," explained Patty, who by virtue of her being 13 years old and head housekeeper had given Maggie the invitation to share her home. "Ma's dead. Seems as if I never did remember her very well, and I've done most of all the bringing up of the twins. Dad's lost. Don't know whar he is, but that don't matter so much, for I would 'a' changed him anyhow, if I could, as I was tellin' ye. Well, after he went and the rent man dumped us on the sidewalk, Miss Whalen, she took us in. Now, there ain't no reason why you can't jine us," continued Patty. "You hain't got no one, and we ain't, and there's heaps of room. Why, we got one whole corner to ourselves. Dar, see?" And she led the way into a good-sized basement kitchen. At one end of the room, where the light from a window on a level with the sidewalk was brightest, Maggie saw a woman and 4 children at work at a table. The floor about them was sprinkled with bits of red, pink, blue, and green, while the table bloomed like a flower garden with pinks, roses, and forget-me-nots. "Oh, how pretty!" cried Maggie, clapping her hands with delight. "Posies," returned Patty indifferently. "They make 'em. But see, this is our house." And she pulled Maggie over to the farther side of the room. On the floor in the corner was an old mattress with 2 or 3 ragged quilts heaped upon it. "We can all use it if we lay close," said Patty. "You know the twins is small." Against the wall was a small cupboard whose shelves, with cheerful indiscrimination, bore plates, cups, spoons, a comb, 2 spools of thread, a cushion with pins and needles, and several bits of soiled. "Ye see, we keeps house," explained Patty, "so we needs dishes and things. Miss Whalen lets us use her stove when we heats up things. See, we've got an extry box all ready for you to sit on, so you won't have to git a single thing. Ain't it nice? You'll come, won't ye?" It was nice, and Maggie said so. In fact, she accepted the offer at once. In comparison with Sullivan's attic and Swaney's cellar, it seemed a haven of delight indeed. She was told, to be sure, that occupancy of the corner meant room rent, not board. They must procure for themselves whatever food they had, for good Mrs. Whalen had many mouths of her own to feed on the other side of the room. "Ye see, we divvy up," explained Patty still further. "We divvy everything. If we gets anything give to us, or if we swipe stuff from windows and bake carts, we divvy up. And if we gets money for anything, we puts it in this tin cup and spends it when we has to. But it's empty now," she added, giving the cup in her hand a rueful shake. "'Tain't neither," cried Maggie joyously, and in the cup jingled a 5-cent piece, dropped from her moist little palm. "We've got 5 whole cents." Oh, boy!" chorused Patty and the twins, and the initiation of the new member of the cooperative establishment was complete. End of Chapter XI, read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter XII of Cross Currents. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. The Whalens made artificial flowers. The children, it is true, went to school, a part of the time, but early in the morning, before school, and late at night after school, They worked with their mother making artificial roses at 9 cents a dozen, and each rose meant a flower with its bud, leaf, and stem.
But the roses ain't live ones, are they?
Maggie had asked that first day that she saw them.
Sure, and of course they ain't that,
Mrs. Whalen retorted in good-natured scorn.
And how, pray, would the fine ladies be a-wearing of 'em in their bonnets if they was? Sure, and they wouldn't keep fresh while ye winked.
Maggie was silent. She gazed at Mrs. Whalen with a troubled frown. Her eyes were somber and perplexed, and seemed to be looking through and beyond the woman into limitless space where a half-forgotten memory was slowly taking shape.
I thought,
she said then, slowly, laying down the rose she had lifted to her face,
I thought flowers smelled good.
One day Mrs. Whalen very obligingly offered to teach Maggie the art of making artificial flowers. Maggie was overjoyed. Was it possible that she could learn to do this beautiful thing?
Miss Whalen, could I?
She cried incredulously.
Sure, and why not? A great girl like you could help me make 'em, anyhow. Why, even Jamie hisself, bless his little heart, does that, and he ain't much more'n 4. Sure ye can do it, and I'll pay ye what ye earn, too, that I will. It shan't be said as how Bridget Whalen is after cheating a poor child out o' her honest wages.
Pay? That was even better than Maggie had expected. Not only was she to handle these beautiful bits of color and fashion them into their wondrous shapes, but she was to receive pay for it. One was paid, to be sure. At least some people were, for sewing buttons onto coarse cloth, or for pasting together the edges of an unlovely brown bag. She could understand that. But this? Maggie began to work at once. Her part was to wind the wire with green paper, thrust the little stamens through the flower petals, or sort the heaps of pink and red petals waiting for their green stems. And it was not long before her thin little fingers became very skillful. To be sure, it took a great many hours' work to earn a very little money. Mrs. Whalen herself was paid only 9 cents for 12 dozen roses, and of course pushing through the stems or sorting out the petals was worth only a very small portion of the 9 cents. Besides, there were so many roses in a dozen. If one really wants to know how many, one should lay them in a spiral line round and round on the table, as Maggie did, and then trace with the finger all the long, weary red way that must be sorted and pushed and twisted before one's share of the 9 cents can be earned. Maggie worked hard, and for long hours at a time. She was ambitious. She did not wish to shirk contributing her share toward the running expenses of the cooperative housekeeping establishment. She did not have to work alone, for, besides Mrs. Whalen, there were the Whalen children. There was no school now, and they could give their undivided attention to the flower-making. They grew thin and tired, to be sure, and all the color from their cheeks went into the artificial roses in their hands. But that did not matter so much after all, however, for in the end it was a gain. The roses in the cheeks brought nothing, while those in the hands brought 9 cents a dozen. Day in and day out Maggie worked at her task. She even sat up until far into the night sometimes. The Whalens did. Why should not she? Twice she fell asleep over her work and had to be shaken gently by Mrs. Whalen. Her thin face grew thinner, and her small back ached with the constant bending. After a time, too, the dye in the brightly colored bits of cloth made her eyes and lips sore. It was then that Patty Murphy came home one day with a bright new 25-cent piece.
"Oh, my, Patty!" cried Maggie in envious delight. "Where did you get it?" "Out of a man's pocket, to be sure," retorted Patty airily. "He dropped it." "And didn't you tell him?" asked Maggie hesitatingly. "Tell him?" exclaimed Patty in open scorn. "No, course not. How'd I got the money if I'd a told him? Say, you are easy." Her eyes swept the table, the flowers, and Maggie's thin little face. "For I'd kill myself over a mess of pink and red posies," she jeered. "This is heaps easier," and she tossed the bit of silver back and forth in her hands.
Maggie was silent. For some days now a horrible thought had come to her with ever-increasing frequency. This flower-making, was it so very different, after all, from the button-sewing and the bag-pasting? Wistfully her eyes followed the sheen of the silver as the coin leaped from one little brown palm to the other. "Patty," she began slowly, "did you ever see any other man drop money?" "Sure, heaps of times," fibbed Patty promptly. "'Fore I'd kill myself over a mess of pink and red posies." She scoffed again. That marked the beginning of the end. The charm of the flowers faded. The glory of earning one's share of 9 cents a dozen dwindled. On the other hand, this amazingly easy accession to wealth and ease, as illustrated by Patty and her 25-cent piece, became more alluring. There came a day at last when Maggie turned her back on the piles of pink and red petals and went out of doors into the street. It was not long before she found how much easier it was, this taking a loaf of bread or an apple from an unguarded cart, or this begging a nickel from a passer-by. True to her training, she kept a wary eye out for the cops, and the fact that she must be so careful lent interest and piquancy to the day's work. To Maggie the whole world was against her. Consequently, she herself was against the whole world. Week by week her wits grew sharper. Month by month her powers of resistance increased. At 7 she was a force to be reckoned with, and at 8 she queened it royally over every boy and girl in the alley. She headed every plot for mischief and dominated every plan for gain. The old woman at the foot of the alley, noted for her persecution of the children in days past, knew her as a terror, and the officer on the corner knew her as the cause of half the trouble on his beat. And yet there was not a dog in the neighborhood that did not bark with joy at sight of her, nor a cat that did not rub against her feet, and there was not a sick baby or a crippled child that did not find in her a never-failing comfort and defense. As for school, Maggie knew little of school, and school knew less of Maggie. The schoolman did not seem to know of her existence. For 2 years now, Mrs. Kendall's daughter had lived in the Whalens' basement room. She was 8 now, a lithe, thin-chested, sharp-featured little creature, very unlike the little maid that had been left in the Grand Central Station 3 years before. The blue eyes were there, it is true, but they were no longer limpidly sweet. They were bright, wide open, and keenly alert for the best chance. The golden curls were there also, but they were cut shorter now, and were tangled untidily. 3 years of neglect and abuse had told woefully upon the child. All the graces of mind and body that were hers by heredity and early training seemed to have slipped from her, leaving her fully exposed to the evils of her environment. Little by little, the old ways had been dropped. Little by little, the old manner of speaking had been forgotten. And Margaret Kendall, dainty, sweet, and lovable, had become Mag of the alley, pert, mischievous, and wilful, but still lovable, for nothing had quite taken away the warm, tender little heart. End of Chapter XII. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter XIII of Cross Currents. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Mrs. McGinnis, Bobby, and the nurse had been sent at once to Houghtonsville, and were now with the rejoicing mother and grandmother in the little red farmhouse on the hill. But Mrs. Kendall and the doctor had remained in New York, she with friends, and he at a hotel not far away. Dr. Spencer had utterly refused to let Mrs. Kendall conduct a search without his assistance, and in this decision he was upheld by old Dr. Kent, now fully recovered from his injury and quite able to care for the patients in Dr. Spencer's absence, particularly as the young man made a flying midnight trip twice a week to Houghtonsville to give a long day's assistance. The rest of Dr. Spencer's daylight hours were spent tramping the New York streets at Mrs. Kendall's side. The search was now very different from what it had been during these weeks after Mrs. Kendall had left the hospital. Then she had visited police courts and orphan asylums. Now she walked from one end to the other of the worst streets of New York, peering into the face of every little girl she met. Long hours were spent in consulting city missionaries and the kind-hearted men and women in the various homes and settlement houses. But nowhere did she find a trace of a blue-eyed, golden-haired child that had answered to the description she gave. Mrs. McGinnis had never found the courage to tell her kind benefactress of the attic room around the corner where Margaret had been taken to work each day of the week she was with them. Therefore Mrs. Kendall knew nothing of Sullivan and his sweatshop, nor did she know of the pawning of the pretty silk coat, dress, and hat. "It wouldn't do no good to tell her them things," Mrs. McGinnis had argued to herself. "It's bad enough for her to know that the little thing got scared one day and run away. That's all, anyhow, that I know about her now." That was many another attic, however, to which Mrs. Kendall climbed, and many a noisome basement which she entered. It was in one of the latter, one day, that she encountered a good-natured woman who was more than ready to talk, though still keeping on with her work of making artificial flowers. "And so it's a pretty little gal ye be after findin', mum, is it?" she asked. "And it's blue eyes she got, and yaller curls?" "Yes, yes. She was in a big hat and a black silk coat with a lace collar. They're probably old and shabby by this time," murmured Mrs. Kendall apologetically. "But it was all she had." "Sure now, black silk, was it?" returned the other interestedly, as she dropped a big red rose into the box at her side. "Well, now, I sure hain't seen nothin' like that, and I'd 'a' known it if I had. Now, thar's that little girl what lives in the corner over thar. She's got blue eyes, and her hair's real yaller, but—" "Is it curly?" "Why, mebbe. Kind of snarled up, you know." Mrs. Kendall shivered. "You say the little girl lives here?" she began hesitatingly. "And she isn't yours?" "Yes, mum. She and the others keep house over thar in the corner." "Keep house?" cried Mrs. Kendall. "Yes," nodded the other, without noticing the shocked surprise in the voice. "With Patty Murphy and the twins. She don't belong to them neither. They just took her in, you know." The woman by the table chuckled until her sides shook, and the little red rose in her hand danced a merry jig. "Timid? Her timid? Well, hardly now. I reckon she ain't on the right track if you're after that kind. Sure, Mag of the Alley is the terror of the hull street, and thar ain't a gal, and not many boys, this side of Bowery that can hold out agin her if she takes a notion to have her own way, and I'm blessed if that ain't the notion she most ginerally does take. Thar don't no one git the best of her, I can tell ye. And yit, sure, I like her in spite of her pesterin' ways. Thar's many a good turn she's done me." Again Mrs. Kendall shivered. This time she drew away from the door with an appealing glance at the doctor. "You're quite right, my good woman," she said huskily. "I am very sure she's not the little girl I am looking for. Thank you for answering my questions," she added hurriedly, going back to the table and dropping 2 bills upon it. And one is for her, that little girl, just for the sake of the blue eyes." She faltered as she backed out the door. Doctor, how can they live like that?" she cried a little later as they hurried down the street. "And to think that somewhere in all this want and misery is my Margaret, my dear tender little girl. Sometimes, doctor, I think I shall lose my mind with the horror of it all, the awful horror of it all." That was the very thing that the doctor feared, and it was that very thing that caused him to spend what time he could at Mrs. Kendall's side. He was there when at last the frail, overtaxed body gave out, and it was he who took the broken-hearted woman back to Houghtonsville, to the lonely house with the big stone lions on either side of the steps, and the little woolly dog all alone in the middle of a sunlit room. End of Chapter 13, read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 14 of Cross Currents. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. There was great excitement in the alley. Katie Goldberg had been away 10 whole days, and now she had returned and was fairly bubbling over with the story of her experiences. "Ye just oughta been thar," she crowed triumphantly from her position on the top step. "It was just grand." "Where is it?" demanded Patty Murphy. Patty was seated sideways on the lowest step, hugging her knees and looking eagerly into Katie's face. "Oh, it's way off.
and the ride to git thar is just as nice as the place is." "Ain't it got no name?" asked another voice. Sure, nodded Katy. It's Oh, I don't believe ye know, now," jeered Patty. "I do, too," insisted Katy. "It's Mount "Maybe it's Mount Washington," cried a big boy from the sidewalk. "I've heard of that. There's snow and ice and rippin' big winds and—" "Well, it just ain't Mount Washington, Tom Whalen," retorted Katy indignantly. "I know what 'tis now. It's Mount Lawn. And there ain't a mite of snow there, nor ice, nor rippin' winds either. They wouldn't allow them thar, so now," she declared with some dignity. "Well, what is there, then?" questioned Tom derisively. "I'll bet ye don't know." Katy tossed her head. Then she held up 10 grimy fingers and began to check off the advantages of the wonderful Mont Lawn, the place where every summer hundreds of little waifs like her spent 10 blissful days. "There's trees and grass and eatin' and sleepin' in beds in a row and flowers and singin' songs and eatin' and playin' and swingin' and eatin'." "Oh, you said that 3 times already," cut in Patty. "Well, we eat 3 times a day," flashed Katy triumphantly. And all we want every time to, taters and meat and berries and cookies and—" "Say, Katy, how much does it cost to get there?" demanded a new voice from the sidewalk. The questioner was a thin-faced little girl with blue eyes and tangled yellow curls. "$3 whole dollars. Skinny Goldstein said so. And ye can stay 10 whole days. Maybe you was a-thinking of going, Maggie, eh?" "Maybe I was," returned Mag of the Alley, with a toss of her head as she turned away. In the corner of the basement room that night, Maggie and the other members of the cooperative household held a council of war. As usual, Maggie was chief spokesman. "Look-a-here, Patty, do you suppose we could do it?" she demanded. "You heard what Katy said, and it must be a awful nice place. You see, there's you and me and the twins, that's 4 of us. And, of course, we couldn't all go and stay 10 days, 'cause that would take $3, and that would be, a awful heap of money, and we couldn't never earn it. But if we could get $3, then we could all go and stay a piece for the 10 days, divvy it up even, you know. What do you say? Shall we try for it?" There was a shout of approval. Then 4 heads bent close together over a prolonged discussion of ways and means. It was agreed that all money should be placed as usual in the old tin cup on the top shelf of the cupboard, only now the most rigid economy was to be practiced. No longer were they to indulge in sumptuous repasts of chipped beef and garlic, pie and cheese, or hot frankfurters when the jingling contents of the cup testified that the day's haul had been good. Rather would they subsist on stale bread, which cost little, or better yet on what they could appropriate to themselves without the formality of asking leave. They estimated that before the summer was gone the $3 ought to be ready. They had only their food to consider. Rent, fortunately, did not enter into the list of expenses, and as for clothing, when one was absolutely in tatters, there was always some kind-hearted woman who had for that one a dress or a coat that would at least hang together. It was while the Committee on Ways and Means was in the height of the discussion that Mrs. Whalen entered the room. "Hi thar, Mag," she called. "Look at what the pretty lady left for ye." And she tossed a crumpled $1 bill across the room. There had been 2 $5 bills on the table when Mrs. Kendall left the place an hour before, but Mrs. Whalen, upon seeing Maggie's share, suddenly concluded to charge rent for the corner, and had decided that $4 was about right. This little matter being settled to her satisfaction, there was of course only $1 left for the child. "It's great luck you're havin', so 'tis." Maggie sprang to her feet and pounced on the bill. Her eyes grew big as she saw what it was. "It's a whole $1, Patty, a whole $1. Why, here, we've got one of the more lawn dollars already, and we don't have to git but 2 more. Only think, Patty, 2 more!" she cried joyously,
and then her eyes narrowed with sudden suspicion, and she turned sharply towards Mrs. Whalen.
"What's that lady want me to do?" she demanded. "To do? Yes, yes. What have I got to do for that $1? Why, nothing. She just give it to ye." "Give it to me?" cried Maggie incredulously. "And ain't she comin' for me to paste no bags, nor sew, nor nothing?" "I reckon not. Anyhow, she said she'd give it to ye because ye've got blue eyes."
For one brief instant Maggie stared in amazement. Then she gave a shrill laugh, but that also was almost instantly checked.
"Look-a-here, Miss Whalen," she called sharply. "There's somethin' here that ain't straight. If that lady what left the $1 comes again, you just tell her I ain't ter home, and I ain't a-comin' back. Tell her I've gone away for my health."
She finished derisively as she caught up the tin cup and crushed the dollar bill into the smallest possible space at the bottom. It was not an easy task, this accumulating riches, but the 4 children worked indefatigably. And bit by bit the hoard in the old tin cup grew. Never before had Maggie worked so late over making flowers. Never before in the neighborhood were errands so swiftly run, nor babies so eagerly tended, and never before did food left out of the window to cool so quickly disappear. In spite of this last fact, however, the children sometimes went hungry to bed. But all the hardships of the struggle were forgotten when on the 1st of August, Maggie, carefully bearing the tin cup, hurried down the street towards the home of the city missionary. The longed-for sum was complete, and Katie Goldberg had said that the city missionary would know what to do with it. Maggie did not know the city missionary. She had seen her once or twice, but she had always run around the corner when the lady appeared in the alley. Maggie did not trust strangers much. She was a little afraid now, but she comforted herself by saying that she was not a beggar, and that she had money to pay. So with head held high and the tin cup clutched tightly in one hand, she rang the city missionary's door bell. 5 minutes later she had told her story, turned the contents of the cup into the missionary's lap, and was breathlessly waiting for the missionary to speak. The missionary did not speak, however, at once. She coughed, choked a little, and wiped her eyes with her handkerchief. Then she smiled a little tremulously. "But, my dear," she said gently, "I can't take this money. We never take money from the children." Maggie's face fell. "Ye see, we wanted to go, so," she faltered. "'Course we couldn't get enough for all of us to stay all the time, but we thought we'd divvy up and each stay part of it. But we had it all fixed." "I know, dear, but you don't understand. The children themselves don't ever pay to go to Mont Lawn. Kind people all over the land send the money and give them the street." The old look of suspicion came into Maggie's eyes. "Give it to him," she cried. "What? For nothing?" "Yes, so that they may have 10 happy days in the country." "And they don't get them there to paste bags, nor sew buttons, nor nothing?" "Why, certainly not. What an idea! What put such a thought into your head, my child?" Maggie was silent. This was even more puzzling than the pretty lady who had left the $1. She could not understand it at all. "You say there are 4 of you?" asked the missionary after a moment. "Yes'm." "Very well, dear. You shall tell me where you live, and this afternoon I'll come to see you. Perhaps, after all, there'll be a chance for some of you to go to Mont Lawn, if not for all of you. We'll see." 5 minutes later, a very dazed but happy Maggie carried towards home, still clutching the old tin cup, a cup which had not lost even a penny of its wealth. End of Chapter XIV. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 15 of Cross Currents. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Great was the rejoicing in one corner of the Whalen kitchen when the astounding news came that Patty, Maggie, and the twins might, after all, go to Mont Lawn, and that not only could all 4 go, but each could stay the entire 10 days. There was to be no divvying up, no moving in the night. Maggie, however, was nonplussed. This wholesale generosity was most extraordinary in her eyes, and the more she thought of it, the more she felt that no good was to come of it. She determined to keep a sharp lookout for some one who would put them to some hated task, and hold them a prisoner ever after. The medical examination at the Bible house was the first ordeal, and it promptly added fuel to the fire of Maggie's suspicions. In spite of the kindness and gentleness of the physicians in charge, the little girl was thoroughly frightened when her own turn came to present herself for inspection. Even the assurance that it was all merely to see if she were quite well enough to go served but to convince her more than ever that hard labor awaited her at the end of the journey. The joyous anticipation all about her, however, proved contagious, and before the Grand Central Station was reached she was almost as excited as the others. "We went in a boat last year," volunteered a small boy at her right, who had been to Mont Lawn before, "and 'twas just grand. But course the cars is just as good, and I never rode in the cars. Did you?" Maggie did not answer. They had entered the great waiting room of the station, and she was looking about her with wide, startled eyes. Sometime, somewhere, she had seen a place like this before. But where? When? "It was big and tall like this, and I stayed and stayed, and then, Her words came more and more slowly, stopping at last altogether. Maggie's recollections of her mother and of her past life were very indistinct. Sometime someone had told her that her mother was dead. She knew that. It had been old Sullivan on the day he had taken her home to be his little gal, and away back in the shadows of her memory were 2 stone lions. But the long days of labor with needle and paste pot, the blows, the angry words were much more vivid, and had blotted out almost everything else. Somewhere in those far-away memories, however, was the vision of a sweet-faced woman with a loving smile, but always, when Maggie tried to place it, it was gone. There was just one tangible thing left her from those forgotten days, and even this possessed no special significance for her, though she sometimes took it out and fingered it curiously, almost reverently. It was a fine linen handkerchief with the name Margaret Kendall in one corner. It had been a tight little moist ball in her fingers that first night when she had gone to bed in the McGinnis attic, and she had kept it ever since safely tucked away in her clothing. Twice she had washed it, and always it had been her dearest treasure. "That was my name once," she would whisper sometimes as she gazed proudly at the letters in the corner, and as she looked, the sweet-faced woman with a smile would seem almost real. The next instant the vision would be gone, and only the letters and the handkerchief would remain. The wait of the Mont Lawn party in the Grand Central Station was not long, and before many minutes the crowd of excited, happy children had marched into the special car waiting for them. Here again Maggie looked about her in perplexity. When before had she seen a long narrow room like this, with windows on either side? Hi, Mag, ain't this great?" called Patty gleefully, and as she spoke the train started. What a ride that was, to be sure! How they chatted and laughed and frolicked, those little waifs from the hot crowded tenements, and as the city was left behind, and the broad fields and far-reaching meadows flashed into view, how wide and wonder-filled grew the eyes that knew only a neighboring roof for a horizon. In the wondrous delight of it all, Maggie almost forgot her fears. Yet the thought would come to her at times. Why was all this pleasure given to them? What must they do at the end to pay for it? When Tarrytown was reached, there was yet another delight, the ferry boat that was to take them across the Hudson. But even the boat ride was forgotten in the excitement of climbing into the big stages that were found to be waiting for them across the river. Then came the 2-mile drive, when each revolution of the wheels seemed to bring yet greater wonder into view, and when each turn of the road was hailed with yet louder shouts of delight. At last the children's paradise, Mont Lawn itself, burst into view, and the little travellers gave one long "Oh!" of rapture. Maggie jumped from her place in one of the coaches and looked sharply about her. Now was a time when one must be very wary. Now was a time when the reason for all this unheard-of generosity would be divulged. All about her the children raced and scampered from point to point, laughing, shouting, and all talking at once. Some were visiting old haunts remembered from last year. Others were exploring for the first time the wonders of the marvelous home that was to be theirs for 10 whole days.
Maggie's dazed eyes swept the wide lawns, the beautiful buildings, and the broad expanse of hillside, but her feet did not stir. She stood alone, silent, wondering, and distrustful, in spite of all the joy all about her. "All alone, my dear?" asked a cheery voice. "Perhaps you have never been here before. Don't you know any of these boys and girls? Would you like to come with me for a walk?" Maggie turned quickly. A bright-eyed, pleasant-faced young woman stood near, holding out her hand. Maggie's first impulse was to grasp the outstretched hand and trust herself to the young woman's guidance. Then she suddenly remembered. Away back in the old days of bag-pasting, the woman that had returned her to the Swaney's cellar had smiled and had been wonderfully gentle at first. It was the second thought that made Maggie turn now and run swiftly away with a frightened backward glance over her shoulder. "Why, the poor little dear," murmured the young woman, gazing after her small guest with a puzzled frown. She had seen many a shy child at Mont Lawn, but never before one with that look of terror in her eyes. Maggie stayed close by Patty and the twins after that, and it was with them that she marched to the beautiful pavilion for supper. What a feast it was, and how the good things did disappear down the hungry little throats. Maggie ate all she could, still with sharp eyes glancing from side to side, and before she rose from the table she managed to secrete in her dress 4 cookies and 2 slices of bread. They were still there when, a little later, she was taken to one of the dormitories that piloted down the long rows of snowy beds to her own especial nest. The same pleasant-faced young woman that had spoken to her before supper spied her now and came to help her undress, and it was she who found the 4 crumbling cookies and the 2 slices of bread tucked inside the ragged little dress. "Why, my dear child, what is this?" she cried in amazement. Margaret flushed. Her eyes grew hard and defiant. She did not reply. "Where did you get this food, dear? Won't you tell me, please?" asked the teacher gently. I hid it when I ate supper," stammered Maggie in a low voice. "But why?" "For tomorrow, of course," returned the little girl in some surprise. "But you'll have more tomorrow at the table, dear. Didn't you know that?" "Yes, I know. Katie said we would, but I didn't believe it." "Why not?" There was no answer. The teacher hesitated. Then she looked at the flushed, defiant little face before her. "Never mind, dear. We will talk of this tomorrow. We want to be quite sure when we take things away with us that they are ours to take," she said gently. "But we will talk about that part tomorrow. You are tired now. I'll promise you this, however, when you shall have all you want to eat every day while you're here." And she stooped and gave Maggie a loving kiss. All the anger and defiance fled from Maggie's face. Into her eyes crept a look of puzzled wonder. Away back in her memory there seemed to be another such a kiss. 2, 3, many of them. But where? When? Who gave them? Maggie was still puzzling over all this when it came time for the evening prayer to be said, and again those faint, far-reaching memories came to her. When had she knelt like this before? When had she said those words? Sometime, somewhere, and the sweet-faced woman of her dreams. She was there too, and then it all fled, and Maggie knew only that she was very tired, and that it was wonderfully cool and comfortable between those smooth white sheets on the little bed. End of Chapter 15. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 16 of Cross Currents. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. For the first 2 days of that stay at Mont Lawn, Maggie was ever on the alert for a paste-pot or its equivalent to be set before her. Her keen, swift-glancing eyes took prompt inventory of every new thing presented for her inspection, and her sharp little tongue demanded the reason for every act she was requested to perform. Gradually, however, the gentleness, love, and happiness all about her did their good work, and the last vestige of suspicion and distrust fled, leaving her stunted, warped little soul free to unfold like a flower in the sunshine. A strange thing happened then. The child seemed suddenly to come into her own. The old pertness, selfishness, and naughtiness fell from her like a discarded garment, and she became almost at once gentle, sweet, and lovable. Even to the teachers she was a puzzle. Other little girls had shown improvement, and great improvement, too. But there never was one like this, never one who seemed so naturally to take upon herself the gentleness of manner and speech that the teachers tried so hard to impress upon the children from the first. To Maggie herself it was like a dream. She seemed to be living in some half-forgotten world of long ago. She was convinced now that this wondrous pleasure time was a gift, pure and simple, and the thought filled her little heart almost to bursting with love and gratitude. And what wonderful days they were! There was the early awakening in the morning with the song of the birds in one's ears, and the joyous call from some other little bed farther down the line. Later would come the morning song of thanksgiving, and the bountiful breakfast which always tasted so good. Where the long hours of the happy forenoon went to, Maggie never could tell, but the swings, the swimming pool, the seesaw, the walks and frolics and merry games, there was never any time to hang heavily on one's hands. Immediately after breakfast, Maggie always felt she never could be hungry again. But when the noon bell sounded, there were the long tables laden once more, and there was her own stomach clamoring for the good things upon them. Maggie never grew tired of seeing the boys gather in front of the big main building at the sound of the bell and take their places 2 by 2, only to separate into 2 long lines at one stroke of the bell, while she and the other girls marched down between the lines and into the dining pavilion. Before eating there was always the grace to be sung with its sweet refrain, God is great and God is good, and frequently there were other songs too. Then came the long bright afternoon with its romps, its games, and with perhaps a story or two, or a new song. Even rain did not dampen the fun, for there was the big playroom over the pavilion, a playroom that made a rainy day an absolute delight. After supper there was the sunset song service in the beautiful temple, with perhaps someone to talk to them, sing to them, or show them stereopticon pictures on a great white screen, all of which was very wonderful to Maggie, as well as to Patty, the twins, and the rest. Then came bedtime hour, and Maggie used to think sometimes that this was the very best of all. Always there was the dear teacher to sing to them and to tell them of the good Jesus who loved them so well, and always there was the bedtime prayer in the hush of the long quiet room. For Maggie there was something else. Never anywhere was the sweet-faced dream lady so near and dear to her as at this hour, and never did she seem so real. It was a very different little Mag of the Alley that, when the 10 days were over, stood once more in the Grand Central Station on the way back from Mont Lawn. The thin little cheeks had grown brown and plump, and the shifting, suspicious eyes looked at you with clear, honest joyousness. The tattered, faded dress had been replaced by a pretty blue and white gingham, and the eager little dancing feet were in neat shoes and stockings. No wonder the people in the station stopped and looked, for Maggie was but one of many, and all alike were tanned and joyous. All the way home Maggie had been thinking, and it was just before they reached the little basement room that she told Patty and the twins her great idea. "You know them $3 that we saved to go to Mont Lawn?" she began eagerly. "Yes," said Patty. "Well, you know we never touched it at all, 'cause couldn't agree what to buy." Yes," murmured Patty. "Well, I've got it all fixed," declared Maggie jubilantly. "Let's carry it down to the missionary lady to take someone else to Mont Lawn." "But she said she wouldn't take it," objected one of the twins. "She said they didn't take it from us children. You told us so yourself." "Pooh! That was when we wanted to buy our own Mont Lawn," retorted Maggie airily. "Don't you see? It'll be just the same as anybody else sending it in, rich folks and all that. Ain't we rich? We got $3 whole." "Yes," acknowledged Patty, and the twins nodded silently. Thus it happened that a certain city missionary the next morning found tied to her doorknob a small brown paper parcel, which upon being untied revealed a dollar bill and a quantity of nickels, dimes, and pennies. On the brown paper itself was scrawled in Patty's best hand the message Maggie had dictated: "To take someone else to Mont Lawn. We are rich, so please don't refuse the money." End of Chapter 16. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 17 of Cross Currents. This recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto.
Mrs. Kendall's illness after that second fruitless search for her young daughter had been very severe. Once more the doctor's buggy made daily trips to the Kendall homestead, and once more old Nathan sat flicking flies from the mare's back out in front of the great stone lions, while inside the house an anxious-eyed man gazed into a pale face framed in waving golden hair. The doctor was worried. Physically, his patient was better, but mentally, the old bitterness had returned to Mrs. Kendall's eyes, and the old listlessness to her manner. In only one respect was she unlike what she had been when recovering from that other sickness months before. She now accepted the doctor's visits without protest, and for that much the man was grateful. "My dear Mrs. Kendall, will you not rouse yourself?" he begged at last one day. "You should be dressed and downstairs by this time." "Why?" Mrs. Kendall's eyes were cold, calm, and questioning. "Why, you are better," stammered the doctor, nonplussed for the minute. "Very well. But what if I am? May I not stay here just as well? What is there for me downstairs?" "But yourself, your friends," protested the doctor. "Only yesterday Mrs. Merton was asking me if—" An uplifted hand arrested his words. "Mrs. Merton has her daughter," cried Mrs. Kendall sharply. "What more can she want with me?" The doctor did not reply at once. When he did speak, his voice was very low. "Yes, she has her daughter, Mrs. Kendall, and if you could know the love and adoration with which those two women regard you, you would not ask that question." There was no answer. Mrs. Kendall had turned her face quite away. 5 minutes later the doctor walked with bowed head down between the big stone lions on either side of the steps. "Home," he said briefly to Nathan, nor did he speak again all the way to the small cottage next, Dr. Kent's, where he lived with an old Chinese servant to keep house for him. Even at home the doctor was still plunged in deep thought. The good supper that his faithful servant set before him was sent away almost untasted, and after supper his cigar went out half-smoked. At last the doctor squared his shoulders and addressed the opposite wall. "I'll do it, and God helping me, I'll succeed. It's not pills and powders she needs, but a vital interest in life, and that she must have, or die." The doctor went about his task in as systematic a manner as if it were a body, not a mind, that he was treating. He had diagnosed the case and written the prescription. He now proceeded to administer the remedy. Day after day, as he called at the Kendalls' residence, he dropped a word or two about some lone woman on a bed of suffering, or some crippled child doomed to have a life of pain. Again it would be of the brave fight of a handicapped man, or of the wonderful patience of an aged woman in the face of a lingering death. Little by little he forced his patient's mind to dwell on something outside of herself. Little by little came his reward, in the shape of an occasional gleam of interest in the sombre blue eyes. It was then that the doctor entered upon the second stage of the treatment. His patient was convalescent. She needed a tonic. He spoke now of what untold joy one woman with time and money at her disposal could bring into the lives of the aged woman, the crippled child, and the handicapped man. It was a long, hard struggle, but in the end the doctor won at least a measure of success. Mrs. Kendall gave some faint show of interest in life. For the doctor, however, there was now a new factor in the case. In striving to do for his patient, he had done for himself. To him had come a most vital interest in life. It concerned a slender, pale-faced woman with fair hair and blue eyes. The doctor was disturbed, seriously disturbed. He had not intended to marry. His heart, mind, and life should be given to his profession, so that he had been wont to think. Now his heart, mind, and life, and even the profession itself, seemed none too great an offering to lay at the feet of that same slender woman. Nor was this all. That Mrs. Kendall would listen for a moment to his suit, the doctor doubted. For months he had been merely her physician. He was that still, with the added honor of being her confidential adviser in the new activities that his own efforts had brought about. They drove together, it is true, but it was to visit some sufferer on a far-away hillside. They walked together, but only when the sufferer lived nearer home. They talked together, and here again were the earmarks of the doctor's efforts to bring into her life a vital interest. Mrs. Kendall talked of what she wanted to do for the lone woman,
the crippled child, and the handicapped man, and in none of these could the doctor find encouragement for the new and vital interest that had come into his own life. It was in the early part of September that Dr. Spencer made a hurried trip to New York, and it was in the Grand Central Station that he ran across the crowd of happy children, each with a bundle and a bouquet of wild flowers. Always now he noticed children when in the city, and always he looked for golden curls and a pair of blue eyes that might remind him of a familiar face. He saw nothing now to do that, but as he watched the children he grew strangely interested in their sunburned, happy little faces. After a minute's hesitation he stepped up to one of the young women in charge, raised his hat, and asked a question or two. When he turned away some minutes later, there was a bill in the young woman's hand which had been left with the request to give the tots a glass of ice cream soda apiece. That night on the roomy veranda just beyond the big stone lions, Dr. Spencer told his friend all about it. That is, all save the bill and the soda. "They had been to Mont Lawn, it seems," he said. "Mont Lawn?" "Yes, a children's home up the Hudson a little way, where the poor little tenement waifs may have a 10-day outing free. It costs $3 for each child, and the money comes from all over the country," the caretaker said. She told of one particularly pathetic case. A friend of hers is one of the city missionaries, and the story came from her. It seems there were 3 or 4 children who had been to Mont Lawn, and who knew what a delightful place it is, and it seems that they had saved up $3 among themselves. Nothing would do but this $3 must be sent for Mont Lawn, so they did it up all in brown papers, all the pitiful little dimes, nickels, and pennies, and one crumpled dollar bill, and tied it to the missionary's doorknob. Then, evidently fearing that some questions would be raised about it, they wrote on the paper, "We are rich, so please don't refuse the money." The little dears! But how did she know from whom it came? The young woman told, but I don't remember. I believe the missionary had seen that same lot of money before, or something. She said that the pitiful part of it all was that the little things probably didn't know where their own next meal was to come from, yet they signed themselves as rich. "Doctor," cried Mrs. Kendall sharply, "when I realize that my own little Margaret may be suffering for just such a 10 days in the country, and with this great house hungering for her, I think I shall go mad. Isn't there something that I can do, that I can give? Can't I help towards this home? Tell me more about this Mont Lawn. If I can't reach Margaret, I can reach some other poor little waif, perhaps." And all that he knew of Mont Lawn the doctor gladly told, nor did he stop there. Afterwards he procured still further information, and before the month was out he had sent on $21 necessary to endow a cot for the season in one of the dormitories. Over the cot was to be placed a picture of a 5-year-old little girl, together with a card bearing the words, "In loving memory of Margaret Kendall." End of Chapter XVII. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter XVIII of Cross Currents. This recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. That first night in the basement home after the Mont Lawn visit was not an easy one for Maggie. The room was hot and close, and she missed the pretty white bed with its smooth, cool sheets. For some time after Patty and the twins were asleep, she lay and thought. For 10 whole days now she had been in that beautiful children's home. Someone, somewhere, had sent $3 that she might have all that pleasure. All around her now were those who had not been to Mont Lawn. Men, women, boys, and girls who scarcely knew what trees and grass and flowers meant. She could not bring back with her the trees and grass and flowers, to be sure, but she could be a little ray of sunshine herself, so the teacher had said. She could smile and sing, and tell the stories she had heard. And besides, had she not given herself to the dear Jesus to be his little girl, and did not he want her always to be cheerful and happy, and to make others so? The teacher had said that he did. And all alone in the dark, on her corner of the old ragged quilt, Maggie whispered once more her bedtime prayer, before turning over and settling herself for sleep. Breakfast was scanty the next morning. The cooperative household was hardly in running order as yet, and there was for breakfast only a little dry bread and mush donated by their neighbor on the other side of the room,
The treasured $3 had been tied to the missionary's doorknob that night before. But even were it not gone, it is doubtful if one of the 4 children would have consented to its sacred completeness being broken by so sordid a thing as the abstraction of a dime for breakfast. Patty and the twins were just about to fall upon their share of the bread and mush when Maggie raised a warning hand. "Shh! Have you forgot?" she demanded. "We didn't sing yet." "Sing? Do ye reckon we could, here? Just us?" cried Patty. "Sure," declared Maggie, and she fearlessly started the song. Over across the room Mrs. Whalen stopped scolding, and her husband stopped swearing. Even the children forgot to quarrel over their breakfast, and as the last sweet "God is great and God is good" died into silence, there was a breathless hush in the room. "Sure, and it's a swate song ye're singin'," muttered Mrs. Whalen at last. "Sing it again, kids." That was but the beginning. Before the week was out, the landlady's children themselves had learned the song, and "Grace Before Meat" became a regular prelude to every meal in the Whalen home. Nor was this all. There were other songs and hymns that Maggie remembered, and in a wonderfully short time she had half the children of the neighborhood organized into a chorus that met every night at sunset for a song service. She kept it up, too, until the cold evenings drove her indoors, and then she begged and usually obtained the loan of somebody's room for the meeting. It was not all music and joy, however, for Maggie, Patty, and the twins. The mere matter of living became a serious consideration, for some features of the cooperative housekeeping had to undergo a radical change. For instance, there was no more appropriating to oneself a pie set out a window to cool, or a bottle of milk left too long on a doorstep. The rights of property holders were better understood now than when Maggie purloined the 4 cookies and 2 slices of bread from the Mont Lawn supper table. There were still flowers to be made, errands to be run, and babies to be tended. However, yet the total income of the 4 children was woefully small, and had it not been for the city missionaries taking matters in hand, no knowing to just what pass things might have come. The city missionary, however, did take matters in hand. The $3 tied to her doorknob were used for Mont Lawn. It is true that the 4 generous givers might not be grieved by its return, but far more than its value found its way into the basement room in the shape of shoes, stockings, and warm little cots and dresses, to say nothing of food. Winter was coming on, and Maggie, Patty, and the twins must go to school, so the missionary said, and the missionary seemed to know, for sure enough, when winter did come, Maggie, Patty, and the twins did go to school. A new world opened then to Maggie's eyes, a world where one learned all sorts of wonderful things, and where one had a beautiful young lady with a sweet smile to say, "Good morning, dear," to one every day. End of Chapter XVIII, read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 19 of Cross Currents. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. It was June, and Houghtonsville was abloom with roses from one end of the village to the other. Even the big stone lions on either side of the steps at Five Oaks looked less forbidding against the red and green of the crimson rambler that trailed up the veranda posts. At all events, they seemed so to Dr. Spencer, coming up the path towards the house. Perhaps Dr. Spencer's wishes colored his vision in a measure. Certainly, on this particular evening, he would like to meet nothing that did not give an encouraging smile. The doctor had come on a special mission. Old Nathan and the mare were not waiting for him tonight. He had sent them home from the last stopping place and had walked the rest of the way to Five Oaks. He came now, not as a physician, but as a man who was about to put to the test the dearest wish of his heart. In the big rocking chair on the veranda, he waited for old Mrs. Barrett to go in search of a mistress, and as he sat there in the fragrant June twilight, he thought of the last 8 months and of what they had brought to him, and to the woman for whom he was so impatiently waiting. At a light step on the gravelled walk he sprang to his feet. "I was in the garden," said Mrs. Kendall a little hurriedly as she ascended the steps, and Dr. Spencer wondered if all the colour in her cheeks came from her haste. Mrs. Kendall was in white, one of the changes the 8 months had brought. Her lips and her eyes smiled, another change, and her slender figure had lost its listlessness. She came straight to the doctor and gave him her hand. "You walked, doctor? I don't see old Nathan," she said. "Yes, from the Hardings. I wanted to see you." There was a slight pause. Something in the man's voice had sent a quick flash of questioning to the eyes of the woman. "Well?" she said gently, as she seated herself near him. "Is it old Tom or Mrs. Barstow, doctor?" The doctor drew a long breath. Then, as was his habit, he plunged at once into his subject. "Neither one," he returned, leaning forward in his chair so that he might look into her face. "I have come to tell you a story." For a moment there was silence. Then the doctor spoke up again. "Up on the hill, Mrs. Kendall, a widow is tonight, as she has been for 4 months past, rejoicing in the return of a long-lost daughter. Beyond her a cripple is the happy owner of a new wheelchair. At the other end of the village a lonely old woman is surrounded by every comfort while she awaits the death that she knows is almost here. Miles away," continued the doctor, paying no attention to Mrs. Kendall's startled look and remonstrative gesture, "miles away a small white bed will hold, one after another, this summer, 7 happy children, while—" Doctor, I beg of you," interrupted Mrs. Kendall with hot cheeks. "Yes, I know," returned the man, "and these are only a very few of the multitude that breathe your name with love and gratitude. Yet in spite of all this," he went on a little unsteadily, "in spite of all this, there is yet one more being for whom I would crave your sympathy. All day he goes in and out of the abode of suffering. All day his heart aches over the misery of others. At night he returns to a lonely table and a solitary hearthstone. He pictures, sometimes, what that homecoming each night would be, if there were a dear face to greet him, a loving heart to throb with joy at his coming. Mrs. Kendall, it is your face that he sees, your heart that he would have throb with joy. Will you come?" There was absolute silence on the veranda. Up in the sky the stars had come out one by one. There was no moon, and the woman's face was in the shadow. The man still leaned forward motionless, his gaze on the dim outlines of the hair, the low broad forehead, and the downcast eyes. "I think I have loved you from the first moment I saw you, dear," he breathed softly. "Will you not answer me?" Mrs. Kendall stirred and her hands fluttered nervously in her lap. "Yes, I too have a story to tell," she said in a low voice, turning her head so that only the profile showed in the dim light. "There was a woman once who lost a little girl in a great city. For a time the woman thought she would die. She even hoped that she would. But she did not die. She lived. And as she saw all around her love and little children and happiness, she grew hard and bitter. She came to hate it all with a terrible hatred. She even hated God himself for taking her baby from her. Then came a man, a strong, clear-eyed man who looked straight into her heart and saw all the wickedness there, nor did he shudder nor turn away. He healed first her body, until, in spite of herself, she was well and strong. Then he opened her eyes to the suffering about her. He taught her that others' lives had their burden of sorrow even as great as her own, and he showed her what she might do to lighten those burdens. It was in that way that she found the lost God of her childhood, the God of love and tenderness and mercy. It was in that way that she found, in a measure, peace. The low voice paused and broke with the last word. There was a moment's silence. Then Mrs. Kendall turned and faced the man at her side. "Doctor, I can't do what you ask. Don't you see that I can't? You have been so good, so true, so patient. I don't want to cause you pain. But I can't do this thing. I can't.
somewhere in the world is my little girl. I feel it. I know it. She may be in misery and want. I couldn't be happy while—"
The man at Mrs. Kendall's side leaned forward suddenly and caught her hands. "Happy! Happy!" he cried eagerly. "Then you would be happy!"
No, I didn't say, I didn't mean," faltered the woman hurriedly, withdrawing her hands. Then her whole manner changed. "Dr. Spencer," she began in a low voice that shook a little, "I made a decision yesterday. I am going to New York. I am going to live among those people. I am going to give my life to them. I shall do what I can everywhere to relieve suffering, but always I shall search for my lost darling. Sometime, somewhere, I may find her. But if I do not, some other mother's darling will be happier, I hope, for my presence." "No, no," begged the doctor earnestly. "You are not well enough, not strong enough yet. Let me search. Let me try once more. Let me go alone, I beg of you. Surely you will grant me this?"
Mrs. Kendall hesitated. Then she rose to her feet and extended both her hands.
"Go,"
she said gently,
"and may God go with you."
For one long minute the man gazed straight into the woman's eyes. Then he reverently kissed the hands he held and turned away. All the way home the doctor's heart sung within him. It was happy. She would be with him. She had said it herself. And to the doctor it seemed at the moment a simple thing to search out every little girl in the world and ask her name, her history, and the color of her hair and eyes. End of Chapter 19. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 20 of Cross Currents by Eleanor Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. No time was lost by the doctor in beginning his quest, and from the very start he had a definite plan of action mapped out. Shrewdly suspecting that Mrs. McGinnis had told not all that she knew, he determined to begin with her, surmising that he might gain some facts not given to Mrs. Kendall, and well understanding that alone he could make a much more exhaustive search of the slums of New York than when with a frail, sensitive woman. Very promptly, therefore, he arranged with Dr. Kent a leave of absence from Houghtonsville for a time, and when all was in readiness, he went to Mrs. McGinnis at the farmhouse on the hill. "I want you to tell, please," he began abruptly, "everything you can remember about little Margaret Kendall, and how she came to you." Mrs. McGinnis shifted her position. A swift red showed in her cheeks. "My Bobby brought her, sir. She stayed a week, and then she went away." "Yes, but why did she go away?" There was no answer. "Why did she go away, Mrs. McGinnis?" repeated the man. "Dr. Spencer, I don't know anything about that poor little lamb. If I did, I'd have told ye long ago," burst out the woman agitatedly. "Do you suppose I'd have kept anything from poor Miss Kendall after all she's done for me, if I knew anything that would do any good? Do you, doctor?" "No," returned the man quietly. "But I think you have kept something from Mrs. Kendall that you imagine would not do her any good to know." Mrs. McGinnis was silent. "And it's that very thing," went on the doctor, "that I'm here today to find out. Won't you tell me, please?" "I can't, doctor." "Why not?" "It wouldn't do no good." "That is your opinion, Mrs. McGinnis. Mine might be different, if I knew the facts. If you love Mrs. Kendall as you say you do, if you are grateful to her as you say you are, you will not hold back one thing. I have begun the search now, and I am going to New York alone. What you tell me need not come to Mrs. Kendall's ear, perhaps, but it is absolutely necessary that I know the whole truth. Now tell me the whole story, Mrs. McGinnis, straight from the beginning." There was a moment's hesitation. Then Mrs. McGinnis bowed her head.
"I'll tell you," she said faintly,
"but you see 'tain't much after all.
Bobby found her crying in the street, and they went back to the Grand Central and left the note. Then he brought her home. That much you know. Bobby told me he thought her mother was the lady that was knocked down in the street. He said he reckoned she was dead. When Jack, my husband, came home, he was half drunk, and he said he was going to let old Sullivan have her to work for him."
"Work for him? That baby?" interposed the doctor, aghast.
"Yes, pull basins and other little things."
"Good God," muttered the doctor under his breath.
"Well, I did what I could, but I couldn't help it at all. He took her there every morning and brought her home every night. I fed and comforted and petted the poor little thing then all I could, but of course I couldn't do much with Jack around. One morning Jack got madder than usual at me, and 'twas while he was chasing me round the room with a chair that the little thing got scared and ran down the stairs. I never saw her again. I swear that's all I know, doctor."
"What was the man's name? Where she worked?"
"Tim Sullivan."
"Where did he live?" Reluctantly Mrs. McGinnis gave the street and number.
"'Twa'n't but a little ways," she said in anxious conciliation.
"When the little girl ran away that day, was she dressed just as she was when she came to you?" Mrs. McGinnis caught her breath sharply.
"No, sir," she stammered.
"What did she have on?"
"An old blue calico that had been my little girl's."
"Where was her own clothing?" No answer. "Mrs. McGinnis, where was Margaret's clothing?" repeated the doctor sharply.
"My husband had pawned them,"
confessed Mrs. McGinnis miserably. The doctor's lips parted. Then a sudden realization of what the woman before him had undergone on account of that same husband silenced the words on his tongue. 5 minutes later he had left the house and was hurrying toward home. In New York Tim Sullivan was with some difficulty found, and the man, supposing that the doctor's information was more extensive than it really was, inadvertently admitted that the little Margaret had worked for him much longer than during the week she was with McGinnis. Hailing this clue with joy, the doctor insisted upon admission to the workroom. It was just here that he met with stout opposition. Diplomacy, threats, and money, however, finally accomplished the seemingly impossible, and the doctor was admitted to the Sullivan home. It looked much as it had in the days when Margaret pricked her fingers and entangled her thread over buttons that would lose themselves on the floor. To be sure, poor little Mrs. Sullivan and the puny baby no longer occupied the bed in the corner. They had found a quieter resting place. But there were just as many huge piles of unfinished garments, just as many pale faces and bent little bodies, just as many patient little fingers hard at work. The doctor shuddered almost visibly, and determined that when Margaret was once found, places like Tim Sullivan's sweatshop should receive a little attention on their own account. He had not supposed such dens existed. Now, however, he gave all his thoughts to the case in hand, and subjected each little laborer to long questioning and sharp scrutiny until he had convinced himself beyond any doubt that Margaret Kendall was not there.
"I told ye she wasn't here,"
whined Sullivan with an injured air.
"She ain't been here for years, and when she was just like my own little gal. My own little gal, sir."
"But where is she now?"
"Sure, and I don't know."
"Where did she go from here?"
"And I don't know that."
Here again the doctor encountered the seemingly impossible, and here again diplomacy, threats, and money worked wonders. Tim finally admitted that he had taken Margaret down to his cousin. To himself, Tim Sullivan declared that he
owed Tom a grudge anyhow.
Armed with the address of this man, the doctor started for the Bowery, hardly knowing whether to hope or fear. Tom Swaney and his paper bags, however, were nowhere to be found. Neighbors said that there had been such a person, and that he had employed children to work for him. Beyond that they knew nothing, at least they would tell nothing, and with this far from satisfactory information, Dr. Spencer went back to his hotel, thoroughly discouraged with his first week's work. End of Chapter 20. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 21 of Cross Currents by Eleanor Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. It was in June that Maggie went to Mont Lawn for the second visit. She had special charge this year of a little crippled boy who, but for her promising to look after him, could scarcely have gone at all. It was a very happy, joyous Maggie that renewed her acquaintance with the old friends in songs and made the acquaintance of new ones. Maggie was 9 now, and a very different Maggie from the little mischievous, distrustful maid that had visited the place less than a year before. But Mont Lawn was the same, and the long days of delight were the same, and Maggie was very sure she had never been so happy in her life. It was early in the morning of the last one of the 10 days that Maggie looked more closely at the pretty little picture face above her bed, noticed the name on the cot card hanging near it. "In loving memory of Margaret Kendall," she read slowly aloud. "Margaret Kendall," she repeated. "Why, that—" With a sudden cry she thrust her fingers into her dress and took out a tiny square of linen always kept pinned somewhere about her. It was yellow and well worn with much handling and folding, but it was clean, and the name in the corner was still plainly to be read. "Margaret Kendall." "It's the same! It's the same! I know it's the same!" cried Maggie, dancing up and down. "She's got my name!" "What is the same, dear?" asked one of the teachers, coming to Maggie's side. "The name! Look!" And Maggie held up the old handkerchief and pointed to the cot card. The teacher stared as she read the two names. She knew the story of the picture and the cot card, and as she looked keenly into the face of the eager little girl, she was sure she could see a resemblance to the picture of the 5-year-old child above the bed. "Where did you get that handkerchief, dear?" she asked tremulously. Maggie shook her head. "I don't know. I've always had it," she stammered, speaking in the slow, dazed way that was always hers when she was being questioned as to that dim, half-forgotten past. "And that is your name, Margaret Kendall?" "I don't know. I think so, but you see, that was before." "Before? Before what?" Before the sweet-faced lady went away," replied Maggie, looking troubled and anxious. "You see, I can't seem to remember. I've been Maggie so long. But the handkerchief's mine. I'm sure of that. I've always had it. I didn't steal that." "No, dear, no," murmured the teacher with a little break in her voice. "Come with me," she added, gathering up the handkerchief, the picture, and the cot card. "Come with me, and we'll see if we can't find out what it all means." Once more Maggie was eagerly questioned, and once more her puzzled little face was scrutinized by keen eyes that picked out point by point a resemblance to the curly-headed little girl in the picture. The result of it all was a hurriedly written letter addressed to H. M. Spencer, M.D. "Dear Sir," ran the letter, "some months ago you forwarded in the name of Mrs. Frank Kendall a photograph of a 5-year-old girl and $21 to endow a cot at Mont Lawn for the season. You also gave something of the sad history of the child, Margaret Kendall, in whose memory the contribution was given. Today, one of our little girls, apparently about 9 years old, spied the name on the cot card and produced a fine linen handkerchief bearing the same name. She claims both name and handkerchief as her own. She is blue-eyed and golden-haired, and not unlike the photograph in many ways. Moreover, she seems to have no relatives that she knows anything about. All this, of course, may be a mere coincidence and may be raising false hopes, but if you will wish to investigate, we are sure. We would suggest, however, that you look into the matter yourself before communicating with the mother, lest our hopes prove groundless. The little girl, Maggie, as she is called, goes back tomorrow to New York, and her 10 days being over then, perhaps you will visit the child in her home and see for yourself whether she really is the lost Margaret Kendall. Enclosed you will find a card bearing name, address, and all available information for ready reference. May the good God guide you in your search, and may it lead to success and happiness. Very sincerely, F. H. Clark. This letter, together with other mail, was forwarded to New York from Houghtonsville, and the doctor received it at the end of his particularly discouraging first week's work. Scarcely daring to believe that the letter itself was a reality, he hurried at the earliest possible moment to the address given and entered the basement room.
"And is it after Maggie ye'd be askin'?"
demanded Mrs. Whalen good-naturedly.
"Sure, and she ain't in, sir."
"But she shall be in soon."
"Maybe so, maybe not. There's no tellin'. She just got home from that there Montlawn business, and what with the singin' and the storytellin' and all, she's mighty busy."
The doctor's face fell. His foot tapped the floor nervously, and his impatient eyes swept the poor little room, pausing at last in Mrs. Whalen's good-naturedly interested face. "What sort of a little girl is this, Maggie?" he asked.
"Sure, and it's an angel she is, sir, straight from heaven," declared the woman. "She's that handy with the kids that it's a pleasure jest to be seen of her round. And what with her bright, cheery ways, the hull block's with her under her thumb, and she can do anything she likes with the hull kit of 'em. But you'd ought to see her before, sir."
"Before?"
"Before she went up country, while them songs she's been a-larnin' was sung, I mean. She was a holy terror, she was, and there ain't a man, woman, or child in the alley that will tell you different. What with her—"
There was a sudden rush of steps at the door, and Dr. Spencer turned to meet a pair of wide blue eyes that he would have known in the uttermost parts of the world.
"Margaret, little Margaret, you are Margaret Kendall,"
he cried joyously. End of Chapter XXI. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter XXII. Of Cross Currents by Eleanor Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. After that first look in the child's blue eyes, Dr. Spencer had not doubted that he had found the real Margaret, but he determined to make no mistake. The child should first be taken to Mrs. McGinnis, and if she and Bobby said it was the same little girl that had come to them 4 years before, he would be sure indeed. As far as Margaret was concerned, he knew of no way but to tell the truth, for she too must help in the identification.
"And it's my mother? My really, truly mother?"
she demanded eagerly. "We hope so, dear, and we think so. I am very sure it is your mother."
"She didn't die?"
"No, dear." There was a long pause. The doctor and Margaret were on their way to Houghtonsville, and the little girl's eyes were fixed on the flying trees outside the window. At last she turned and regarded the man at her side with a troubled gaze.
"Dr. Spencer, does mother want me?"
she asked timidly. "More than anything else in the world," returned the man a little unsteadily. "She has longed for you all these years."
"Oh,"
breathed the little girl ecstatically.
"I like to be wanted, you know."
The doctor smiled a bit sadly. He, too, would like to be wanted, in this particular case. Then he looked down at the little girl near him. He was glad that there would be no heartache in the first glance that the mother would catch of her child. Margaret, in the dainty new garments the doctor had brought for her, looked almost as well fed and well cared for as had the little 5-year-old maid left in the Grand Central Station 4 years before. His thoughts were interrupted by a light touch on his arm.
"Dr. Spencer, please,"
began Margaret again.
"is my mother's house big, real big?"
"Why, yes," returned the doctor.
"And has it got grass round it and trees?"
"Yes." Margaret's eyes began to shine. She gave a delightful little bound in the seat as she demanded.
"And is she rich, awful rich?"
The doctor frowned. This anxiety for wealth was not quite what he liked to see at just this time. Margaret noticed the frown and the hesitating manner. Her face fell.
"Oh, dear, I'm so sorry. I did so hope she was rich."
"Why?" asked the doctor almost sharply. Margaret sighed.
Well, you see,
She began timidly.
there's all the Whalens and Timmy Carney and Miss Linderbaum and, oh, lots of others. And they haven't ever been to Mont Lawn. Some of them couldn't, anyhow, 'cause they're too big, And I thought if my mother's house was big and had trees and grass, and if she could afford it, why, maybe she'd ask them to come and see us.
Oh, said the doctor with a broad smile as he thought of his fears of a moment before. Well, we'll see about that later, my dear. I am positive, however, that your mother will be glad to have you tell her all about the Whalens and Timmy and the rest, and she will have something to propose that will make them happy, I'm sure. And now we're almost there ourselves. At Houghtonsville, Dr. Spencer lifted Margaret into his waiting carriage and told old Nathan to drive straight to the Merton farmhouse. Much to his disappointment, however, Margaret failed to recognize either Bobby or his mother.
After all, it ain't so strange, Doctor, comforted Mrs. McGinnis. She was such a little thing, and she stayed such a little bit of time. Besides, Bobby's changed a lot, and I reckon I don't quite look the same. But it is she. It is the little girl that came to you, begged the doctor. Why, yes, I think so, assured Mrs. McGinnis. But you see, I didn't have her long, and she cried most of the time she was there, poor dear. The doctor was silent. The child, too, was silent. A look of terror was creeping into her blue eyes. Is that my mother? She asked at last in a low voice. No, no, dear, murmured the doctor abstractedly. Then he added, turning to Mrs. McGinnis. Why, woman, I'd stake my life that she's Margaret Kendall. There was the name on the handkerchief. Besides, she looks like Mrs. Kendall. She has her eyes. Yes, I know, acknowledged Mrs. McGinnis. And it's her, no doubt. Still, if there was a way somehow, if Miss Kendall could see her first, before you had told her you had found her, if— I have it, cut in the doctor suddenly, his face alight as a swift thought came to him. Keep Margaret here. I'll be back. And with the words he was gone. Down at Five Oaks, a little later, he forced himself to walk calmly up the steps between the two stone lions. Mrs. Kendall herself met him on the veranda. You've not given up? She faltered nervously as he took her hand in both of his. No, dear friend, he said quietly, wondering if she could hear the exultant pounding of the heart so near her own. I shall never give up. I have come with another story. A swift red showed in Mrs. Kendall's cheeks as she sat down. She remembered a certain other story that this same man had told her not long before. The doctor saw the blush and divined its cause, a fact which did not tend to steady his voice. I have found a new object for your love, a new candidate for your sympathy, Mrs. Kendall. A little girl whose short life has seen such misery, a child who, I believe, has no mother unless yourself will be one to her. Will you love her? Quick tears sprang to Mrs. Kendall's eyes. Poor little dear, I love her already, she said gently. And will you take her into your home? Doctor, you wouldn't. You couldn't ask me to do that. I know. It is much to ask, he said. For a moment the woman opposite did not speak. Then she began hurriedly. I have learned much in the past year, Doctor. I have suffered much. I have given up much. But there is yet one spot that quivers at the lightest touch. There is yet one thing I cannot bring myself to change. You must know what that is. Yes, I know. But I had hoped— The doctor paused, leaving his sentence unfinished. I cannot, Doctor. No foot but mine has ever crossed the threshold of that room. No hand but mine has ever touched a toy or book. They are as my dear little girl left them, don't you see? Can't you understand? The doctor bowed his head.
I understand," he said gently. It was a long minute before Mrs. Kendall spoke again. "Where is the child? Tell me about her." "I brought her with me."
Oh,
There was real pain in Mrs. Kendall's voice.
then she is here.
"Yes."
But tell me about her."
The doctor hesitated. Should he give this mother the history of those 4 years of suffering, misery, and want? That the child was Margaret Kendall he did not doubt, and if she was, the mother would insist some time on knowing all that he knew of those 4 years. Perhaps, after all, it might be as well to tell it now when she could not know for the time being that it was to the life story of her own child to which she was listening. The doctor raised his head. "I will tell you," he said. "I will begin with the time when, as a very little girl, she was set to work sewing buttons in an attic room in New York." Slowly, softly, and very tenderly the doctor began his story, telling everything that he had been able to discover of Margaret's daily life during those 4 years, omitting only the part that might serve to identify her as Margaret Kendall. From Margaret's own lips he had learned much, and this, together with what he had discovered from other sources, made his story complete. Very gently he touched upon the want and suffering, and pictured the lonely little maid with the whole world to fight alone. He told of the attic sweatshop and of the cellar where tiny little fingers pasted bags. He told of the dinnerless days and supperless nights, and of the struggles to maintain the cooperative housekeeping establishment in one corner of the Wayland basement. He pictured, too, the result of all the neglect and abuse, and gently touched upon the qualities that made the poor little half-starved waif the terror of the alley. Then he told of Mont Lawn, and of the blessed change it had wrought, of the sunshine and cheer that one little maid had brought back to the alley. He finished by picturing Margaret as she was now, with her winsomeness and her hunger to be loved and wanted. As the last word fell from the doctor's lips, Mrs. Kendall sprang to her feet. Her lips trembled and her eyes were wet.
"I will take the child," she said brokenly. "Bring her to me."
Not trusting himself to speak, the man turned and hurried down the steps. Half an hour later he passed once more between the stone lions, leading a 9-year-old little girl by the hand. Silently, old Mrs. Barrett admitted them to the little reception-room and went to call her mistress. Dr. Spencer was sitting opposite the door, and he saw Mrs. Kendall's face as she entered the room. There was a long, wondering look, then a rapturous cry.
"Margaret, Margaret, my own little girl!"
And Mrs. Kendall was on her knees, with the child in a close embrace. Very softly the doctor turned to go. The place was sacred. He had no right to be there. He had almost reached the door when there was a swift step at his side. A slender hand touched his arm. Mrs. Kendall, with Margaret still clasped to her heart, was looking with luminous eyes into his face.
"And you,"
she faltered.
"it is to you I owe it all."
For an infinitesimal moment she paused. Then the rich red dyed her face.
"I'll be as happy now as you like,"
she whispered.
"And the doctor was just as glad to see my mother as I was,"
said Margaret afterwards.
"Else, why did he kiss her too?"
The end. End of Chapter 22. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. End of Cross Currents by Eleanor H. Porter.